action, the chair is authorized to declare the committee in recess at any point. Today, the committee is meeting to examine the dynamic terrorism threat landscape and discuss why the threat is dominated by domestic violent extremists, including white supremacists. Almost 1 year ago, this committee held its first hearing of the 117th Congress, examining the threat of domestic terrorism in the wake of the January 6th attack on the Capitol. Since that hearing, I've taken on a new role, chairman of the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol, where I'm working across the aisle to get to the bottom of that attack. Here on the Homeland Security Committee, our mandate is to carry out broader oversight to better understand what DHS, the FBI, and other federal agencies must do together with their state and local and private sector partners to detect, prevent, and respond to terrorism. Too often, our public spaces are subject to shootings or hostage taking or other violent plots that see grocery stores, schools, houses of worship, or concerts become crime scenes. In June of 2015, a young man sought refuge in a Charleston church, expressing what seemed to be genuine interest in their regular Bible study meeting. Motivated by a desire to start a race-fueled civil war, he opened fire, killing 9 African American members of the Bible group that had just welcomed him in. Since that tragic attack, there have been countless other acts of terrorism and violence carried out by people with a variety of extremist views. The FBI director testified before this committee that last year his agency had the largest number of open domestic terrorism cases ever. He went on to say that the majority of those cases involve white supremacist extremists. He also described how violent extremists are choosing aspects of different ideologies that fit their unique grievance, or if choosing individual items from a salad bar. The emergence of what the FBI has come to call salad bar ideologies is a paradigm shift. Terrorism threats that has made it harder for law enforcement to prevent attacks. Over the past year, threats posed by converging violent ideologies have increased, as ideologies that once were thought of as friends have become more mainstream. I appreciate the steps DHS and others have taken over the past year to try to address this issue, especially after the previous administration ignored it for 4 years. Certainly, the issuance of the first ever national strategy for countering domestic terrorism last June was an important step forward. I also appreciate the work many in the private sector and civil society are doing to protect our communities and prevent the internet from being used to spread disinformation, radicalize people, or plan attacks. But much more must be done, and we are eager to hear from our witnesses and solutions today. We must be clear-eyed about the threat from violent extremists and focus our efforts on finding appropriate solutions that improve our homeland security and allow people to go about their lives. Just last month, a man flew from the UK to the United States and made his way to a synagogue in Texas, specifically targeting worshipers from their Jewish faith, for their Jewish faith. He pretended to be a homeless man seeking shelter and appealed to their humanity. Like we saw in 2015 at the Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, the attacker preyed upon kindness of people of faith to carry out his attack. Thankfully, this time there was no loss of life. Our job on this committee is to focus on security and keep our fellow Americans safe. We must prioritize helping people congregate in a manner that allow at-risk communities to live their religious tenets and show kindness to those in need. Today, we have an expert panel of witnesses that will outline the dynamic terrorism threat landscape we face and present their ideas about what we ought to do moving forward. I look forward to their testimony and responses to our questions so that we can find a path to keep us all secure. American lives, our way of life, our very democracy are at stake. With that, I recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Katko, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, I thank the witnesses for being here as well. And I anticipated that the chairman would speak to the domestic violent extremism that is rampant in our country right now. So I chose not to replow that ground for the most part, but I do want to make sure that the chairman and everyone knows that I agree with your comments. And we need to be mindful of that. I want to talk more about what I see as kind of the concern in the arena of the international extremism coming home here once again. And so our committee and the Department of Homeland Security were created to address terrorist threats facing the homeland. And it is incumbent upon us to remember precipitating events and warning signs which led to our existence. In 1993, a van containing over 1,000 pounds of explosives was detonated in a parking garage of the World Trade Center, killing 6 people and injuring 15 others. Ramzi Youssef, one of the plot's leaders and the nephew of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, later told the FBI he had hoped to topple one tower into the other, killing approximately 250,000 civilians. In 1998, 224 people died, including 12 Americans, when nearly simultaneous bombs blew up in front of the American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. Soon after, these attacks were linked to Al-Qaeda. In 2000, the USS Cole was refueling off the coast of Yemen when suicide terrorists launched an attack, killing 17 American sailors. The U.S. government investigation determined that Al-Qaeda was behind the bombing. Less than a year later, on a Tuesday morning in September, America learned exactly what Al-Qaeda was capable of. And now, 20 years after 9/11, terrorist safe havens still exist in locations spanning from West Africa to, sadly, once again, Afghanistan. I understand that Americans are exhausted by endless wars, but we must remember wars are two-sided. The terrorist threat will not cease because we pick up and leave. We need to recognize that while it is possible to degrade terrorist operations when we utilize the power of American intelligence and military enterprises, it is just as easy for terrorism to reconstitute when it is given sanctuary. And that is my concern today. The war on terror is not a war which is going to end with a treaty signing and a ticker tape parade. And it's not a war which we have won or lost. In fact, it's not over and probably never will be. However, the Biden administration has seemingly disengaged to some extent. The Biden administration's botched withdrawal from Afghanistan has cost the lives of 13 service members and has reinvigorated terrorist networks in the region and around the world. We must be clear-eyed about what is an evolving threat landscape and admit the failures that happened in Afghanistan. There are 2 lessons we must learn from past experience. The first is, given safe haven, terrorist networks will undoubtedly utilize that time and space to plot attacks against the homeland that are more intricate in nature. The second lesson is that we cannot ignore the signals foreign terrorist organizations are now sending. Many of these warning signs are seen internationally, but many are also seen here at home, unfortunately. Just 2.5 weeks ago, a British citizen named Malik Fazal Akram barricaded himself along with several hostages inside the Congregation Beth Israel Synagogue in Colleyville, Texas. Akram demanded the release of Afia Siddiqui, a terrorist who has been tried and convicted of attempting to kill U.S. officers in Afghanistan. As American citizens, we are incredibly grateful to our brave federal, state, and local law enforcement agents for their actions during this incident. But we cannot take this outcome for granted. Having experienced the Naval Air Station Pensacola shooting just a couple of years ago, we know that these attacks can be deadly. I am, to say the least, concerned about how Akram was able to obtain clearance through the visa waiver program. He clearly had a troubled past and a very serious criminal record, and the British knew about that. At a minimum, this should have triggered a heightened level of screening and vetting. Why it did not is something we need to examine and discuss. These are issues which I'm addressing with the Department of Homeland Security and their agency partners, but which we all should be considering as we influence Homeland Security policy. Additionally, the troubling lack of clear communication information sharing, and effectiveness displayed by Homeland Security among its interagency partners and Congress during recent events such as one in Colleyville gives me cause for continuing concern. The terror threat is one that we face on many fronts. We cannot ignore the battlefields in the Middle East, Afghanistan, and Africa. We must be cognizant of the growth of extremism in the West and work with our international partners to identify and neutralize the threat there. We must arm our Homeland Security colleagues with the tools they need to recognize the threat at ports of entry and keep those actors from making it to the interior of the United States. And finally, we must combat the threat of terrorism, whether foreign-born or homegrown, as my colleague Mr. Thompson pointed out, or domestic, which exists within our borders. If we don't maintain a holistic approach to combating this threat, we will face more acts of terror on American soil. And I hope that we can work together in this committee in a bipartisan manner we always do to get things done and continue to attack these very difficult problems. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentleman yields back. Other members of the committee are reminded that under the committee rules, opening statements may be submitted for the record. Members are also reminded that the committee will operate according to the guidelines laid out by the chairman and ranking member in our February 3rd colloquy regarding remote procedures. I welcome our panel of witnesses. Our first witness is Mr. Nicholas Rasmussen, the Executive Director of the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, or GIFT-CT. Mr. Rasmussen had held senior counterterrorism positions at the White House and in U.S. intelligence community over the course of his 27-year career, concluding his service as director of the National Counterterrorism Center. Our second witness is Jonathan Greenblatt, CEO and National Director of the ADL. Mr. Greenblatt brings extensive experience from the private sector and government. Under Mr. Greenblatt, ADL has worked in new and innovative ways to counter and combat extremism in all forms. Our third witness is Dr. Cynthia Miller Idris, professor of American at the American University. Dr. Miller Idris is a professor of the both School of Public Affairs and the School of Education at AU, and has studied the dynamics of violent extremism globally for over 20 years. Our final witness is Mr. Bill Rigel, and I hope I didn't do too much damage to you, Mr. Rigel. He's also a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, where his work focuses on the global war on terror. Without objection, the witness's full statement will be inserted in the record. I now ask Mr. Rasmussen to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Thompson. Thank you, Ranking Member Kotko and members of the committee. It is indeed my privilege to join this important hearing this morning. And as you said, Mr. Chairman, I'm here today in my capacity as the Executive Director of GIFT-CT, the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. And in that current role, my focus is particularly on the online dimensions of the threat landscape that both you and Mr. Kotko outlined in your opening statements, both here at home and around the world. And of course, this is not my first appearance before this committee. During my tenure as the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, I had the honor to appear before you and the committee on many occasions, and I had countless other informal conversations with members during that time, and I'm grateful for the support of the committee during my time at NCTC. GIFT-CT is a 501c3 nonprofit organization with the mission to prevent terrorists and violent extremists from exploiting digital platforms. We offer a unique multi-stakeholder setting to identify and solve the most complex problems that sit at the intersection of technology and terrorism. We were founded in 2016 by 4 major technology companies, but we're now a nonprofit organization with our own staff, professional staff of terrorism and technology experts working with our 18-member companies in a much wider global stakeholder setting. And before I highlight our key priorities and work streams, I'll touch just very briefly on a few elements of the current landscape that both you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Kotko highlighted in your opening remarks. The online dimension of this landscape is a very dynamic environment, and the community of violent extremist and terrorist voices is becoming ever more diverse, and it represents an ever wider array of violent extremist ideologies. Groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda continue to exploit the online environment, as do white supremacist and neo-Nazi organizations around the globe, accelerationists, ethno-nationalists of various forms, violent extremists of the incel movement, and others who propagate conspiracy theories that lead to violence. The extremists and terrorists that operate today in the online domain are agile and adaptive. They migrate readily and easily from one platform to another depending on their purpose. Terrorists and violent extremists, as we know, have always adapted themselves to the tactics that intelligence and law enforcement services use to disrupt them. And they, of course, do the same when it comes to their use of modern technology. And this poses a challenge to those charged with enforcing platform policies for tech companies. And the diversity and variety of violent extremist actors operating on the internet is matched by an equally diverse and varied set of platforms on which they operate. None of us, Mr. Chairman, use just one platform or app on our phone today. Violent extremists are the same, and most often they use several different services, including services that go well beyond social media platforms. Responding to this environment, of course, requires a global and diverse response. And for that reason, a top priority for me and our GIFCT team this year is to expand our membership to bring in a much wider and more diverse range of tech companies. It's not enough for GIFCT to be focused on social media or on Silicon Valley alone. The effort must extend globally, and it must involve companies and technologies of all sorts. In my written statement, I've set forth in detail key initiatives we're pursuing to achieve our mission, to include helping companies develop more useful definitional frameworks that will help them respond to online terrorism and violent extremism. Another critical effort of our work is to strengthen the capacity of member companies to respond in real time to a real-world terrorism crisis. By facilitating real-time situational awareness and information sharing among our member companies during an attack, we identify any online dimensions so that members can take swift action against content that a perpetrator might be looking to post in the online environment. And the multi-stakeholder nature of our work is perhaps best highlighted by our GIFCT working groups, where we bring together experts from very diverse stakeholder groups, geographies, and disciplines to focus on discrete and specific challenges we're facing. It's this attribute of multi-stakeholderism that makes GIFCT unique, and I would argue in many ways an experiment. It's a forum in which all of the relevant stakeholders who share in the problem set are invited to participate. And we've certainly valued having participation from the US government and from federal law enforcement. Solving these terrorism problems requires a whole of society approach, not just a whole of government approach. And as I left government service a few years ago, it was clear to me that more of the work necessary to do this takes place outside government than perhaps I appreciated. This means collaboration with the private sector, academia, and civil society. And with the continued support of this committee, Mr. Chairman, and that of other critical stakeholders here in the United States, I'm optimistic we can make the online environment safer and healthier for all of us. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your attention this morning, for the invitation to appear, and I look forward to the conversations.
Ms. Greenblatt, you recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Katko, members of the committee, and my fellow panelists. Good morning. I'm Jonathan Greenblatt, CEO and National Director of the Anti-Defamation League, or ADL. ADL is the oldest anti-hate organization in America, and it's an honor to appear before you this morning to address the threat of extremism and terror in the homeland. Since 1913, ADL has worked to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment to all. We have a world-class team, including analysts and experts and investigators who track extremist threats and have been doing so for decades, monitoring threats from all sides. But let's be clear, violent domestic extremism is on the rise and it threatens all of our communities. And the Jewish community continues to be a primary target of extremists across the ideological spectrum. Just 2 weeks ago in Colleyville, Texas, an Islamist-inspired terrorist fueled by anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about Jewish power traveled thousands of miles to take 4 people hostage at gunpoint in a synagogue during a Shabbat service in an attempt to free an Al-Qaeda operative who herself espoused incredibly hateful views about Jews in her public trial. The crisis in Colleyville was a painful reminder that the threat to the Jewish community in America remains significant and lethal. In fact, ADL has recorded a 115% increase in anti-Semitic incidents from 2015 to 2020. That's an alarming spike. But the data obscures the human toll. I'm talking about thousands of acts of hateful anti-Jewish harassment, of ugly anti-Semitic vandalism on synagogues, on schools, on homes. Hundreds of acts, brutal acts of assault against Jewish people, and at least 18 anti-Semitic murders that devastated families, shattered communities, and stunned the country, from Pittsburgh to Poway to Orange County to Jersey City to Muncie, New York. The human toll is considerable. And in a country riven by political differences, I'm sad to report that anti-Semitism knows no partisan bounds. As I've told this committee in previous hearings, neither side of the spectrum is exempt from intolerance nor above anti-Semitism. Politicizing the oldest hatred is a tool that we regrettably see from politicians on both sides, and it needs to stop. At ADL, we're particularly troubled by the rise of domestic violent extremism, including, as Nick mentioned, white supremacists, armed militia groups, accelerationists, QAnon enthusiasts, sovereign citizens, and others who demonize the Jewish people. Some of these actors, they trumpet the replacement theory that posits that a cabal of Jews are seeking to commit white genocide. It's frightening to think that this concept has been mainstreamed in recent years, yet some prominent conservative voices continue to make outlandish, grotesque claims that suggest that Jewish philanthropists are seeking to flood America with migrants, not true, or other bewildering charges. From Charlottesville to Capitol Hill, there's a through line, and it's played out with deadly results. And at ADL, we're also troubled by the rise of hateful anti-Israel forces that demonize the only Jewish state in the world. From pro-Iranian outlets spreading slanderous lies on social media, to self-described activist groups targeting Jews in public places, to NGOs like Amnesty International issuing reports making wild, incendiary accusations against the Jewish state, accusing it of apartheid or genocide, deeming it illegitimate. It is frightening to think that these concepts also have been mainstreamed in recent years, as some so-called progressive voices make outlandish, grotesque claims that suggest that Zionists are seeking to enslave the Palestinian people, not true, or other bewildering charges. From Times Square to Colleyville, there's a through line, and it's played out with terrifying results. So we can and we must do more to prevent these kinds of tragedies from happening again. When I had the honor of appearing before you last year, I called for an all-in government approach and a whole of society strategy to combating domestic extremism. We've made real progress since then, but much more needs to be done to meet the moment. So with that in mind, I again respectfully call on Congress to take meaningful action to combat extremism in a domestic context. This should start by adopting the principles of PROTECT, ADL's comprehensive 7-point plan to mitigate the threat posed by domestic terrorism while protecting civil liberties and staying true to American freedoms and values. Our recommendations include passing the Bipartisan Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, ending the complicity of social media services in facilitating extremism and hate, creating an independent clearinghouse for online extremist content, and doubling the funding for the nonprofit security grant program. You see, people should not be risking their lives when they choose to worship in a synagogue or shop in a kosher supermarket or simply live openly as Jews in America. So yes, we need safety through security, and DHS grants can help. But we also need safety through solidarity. We can never build walls that are high enough or secure our networks tightly enough to ward out all evil. This is why we need all of you and public figures to call out hate whenever it happens, regardless of the source, and why we hope other communities will stand with the Jewish community as we've sought to rally by their side in the face of racism and intolerance leveled in their direction. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now ask Dr. Miller Idris to summarize her statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Katko, and members of the committee, I'd like to thank you for calling attention to the critical issue of changing trends in global and domestic terrorism. I'm honored to be here with you and with my fellow esteemed panelists as well. I am a researcher and an academic, but I'm also an applied scholar who directs a research lab at American University called the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab, or PERIL, which designs and tests early interventions and preventative tools to disrupt and prevent violent extremism across the ideological spectrum. Domestic violent extremism and terrorism has escalated rapidly across the West and now significantly outpaces other forms of terrorism in the United States, including terrorism from far-left movements and from individuals inspired by the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, with right-wing attacks and plots accounting for the majority of all terrorist incidents in the United States since 1994, according to data from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. This does not mean that the threat from jihadi terrorism has abated, either in the US or abroad, but it does mean that we're seeing growth across the West at 250% over the last 5 years in the domestic violent and far-right terrorist spectrum in ways that pose an escalating and serious threat. Historically, counterterrorism officials across the world have organized their work around clearly identifiable groups and movements, which were considered ideologically distinct from one another. But today, as the chairman pointed out earlier, there is growing blurriness across previously distinct ideologies in online extremist networks. A new report issued just last week from the UK-based International Center for the Study of Radicalization traces convergence between neo-fascist accelerationists and Salafi jihadists that includes shared support for anti-Semitism, belief in a natural hierarchy, racial and cultural supremacism, anti-modernism, heteronormativity and support for traditional family structures, and anti-government sentiment. Both domestic and international terrorist groups and movements, in other words, are united by an overlapping set of beliefs involving supremacist hierarchies and anti-government beliefs. These extremist ideologies often also share fantastical ideas about restoration, whether it's the caliphate or a white ethno-state, and a desire for a post-apocalyptic, post-race war civilization in which violence is a solution to accelerate the end times. The muddling of ideological rationales, what some call salad bar terrorism, is partly a result of the way that people encounter extremist content and propaganda online, largely outside the boundaries of organized groups, not just in manifestos, but also in memes, across a large and broad ecosystem of video, audio, and text-based platforms. Recommendation algorithms and hyperlinks mean that everyone is just a few clicks away from an ever-expanding series of rabbit holes that offer up entire worlds of disinformation, propaganda, and hate that they increasingly piece together in fragmented ways. Counter-extremism tools designed to address threats from bounded fringe groups as they currently exist cannot meaningfully confront the evolved threats that we face today without a broader, multi-sectoral, whole-of-society and community-based commitment to prevention and early intervention that can reduce the fertile ground in which anti-democratic and violent extremist ideologies thrive. To do this, Congress should take immediate steps to invest in a public health approach to preventing violent extremism. This includes investments in digital and media literacy and other scalable interventions to reduce people's vulnerability to online propaganda and conspiracy theories. It includes broadening tested inoculation interventions to make people less likely to be persuaded by extremist content and manipulative tactics from extremist groups. It calls for a reinvestment in civic education and other efforts to strengthen democratic norms and values that could reduce high rates of polarization and the kinds of moral disengagement and dehumanization that are demonstrated precursors to political violence. These kinds of interventions are not an immediate fix to the growing problem of extremist violence and terrorism. Rather, they reflect a need for investments across the short, medium, and long terms. And it is important to note that these are not options that involve censorship or teaching ideological beliefs in any way. After all, no one wants the federal government to be involved in policing people's beliefs. But the narrow definition of prevention of violence in our conventional counterterrorism tools are unable to address the unchecked spread of disinformation and conspiracy theories and other precursors to violence. We need to broaden our efforts and adapt counterterrorism frameworks to address these evolving threats with preventative approaches that can address radicalization while still protecting freedoms of speech and expression. Understanding the nature of the evolving threat is an essential first step toward these goals and to reducing these persistent and changing threats to our nation's democracy and stability. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now ask Mr. Roggio to summarize his statement for 5 minutes. And I hope I didn't do you too much harm in my pronunciation.
Thank you, sir. No, it's just fine. It's Roggio. Chairman Thompson, ranking member Katko, and distinguished members of this committee and my fellow panel members, thank you for this invitation to speak on this very important issue. In addition to being a senior fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies, I also edit the FDD's Long War Journal. This is where we document, track the war on terror, not just jihadist groups and their operations, but what the state sponsors of terrorists are doing. One of the things you all are probably very familiar with my work, even though you don't know it. If you were watching Afghanistan over the summer and all of the news outlets were running a map, that was something I created beginning in 2014 because I saw the flaw in the U.S. counterinsurgency strategy and Afghan counterinsurgency strategy. They were ceding ground to the Taliban, which allowed them to build their insurgency. So when our leadership stands up, and they've done this to Congress, and they've said, we couldn't have foreseen the failure in Afghanistan. No one knew it was happening. That's untrue. That's false. My colleague, Thomas Jocelyn, and I, we understood exactly what was happening. We predicted the failure in negotiations. We documented the ties between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and the support for Pakistan and Iran in the Taliban's operations. We did this over the course of time. So this is where I base a lot of my work from. The threat posed by international terrorist organizations has increased over the past year as the U.S. continues to disengage from multiple theaters. Nowhere is this more visible than in Afghanistan, where the U.S. precipitously pulled out. Afghanistan is now a terrorist safe haven. The withdrawal from Afghanistan was disastrous on many levels. The U.S. now has virtually no capabilities. I'll call it very limited capabilities to strike our enemies there, as well as enemies that were in Pakistan. We should all remember the concerted U.S. drone campaign under the Bush and Obama administrations that targeted top Al-Qaeda leaders. Al-Qaeda is still in Pakistan, and it has never left Afghanistan. And we have virtually no ability to strike them there. Ayman al-Zawahiri, Al-Qaeda's emir, who was the deputy emir on 9/11, 20 years after 9/11, he's still alive, and he is somewhere in between Afghanistan and Pakistan, and we have limited ability to target him. The Taliban and Al-Qaeda, they've withstood 20 years of war against the superpower, and they've come out on top. The withdrawal has given Al-Qaeda and its allies a massive propaganda victory. And the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, that's the name the Taliban that's what the Taliban called itself up to the day of 9/11 until the US ejected it. It has been restored. That was the goal of the Taliban all the time, and we refuse to recognize this. The Taliban are not our partners, and I use partners in quotes, as CENTCOM Commander General Frank McKenzie has referred to them. The Taliban remain closely allied with Al-Qaeda. Sirajuddin Haqqani, the deputy emir of the Taliban and its current interior minister, he was described by the United Nations early to mid last year as an Al-Qaeda leader. This is the deputy emir of the Taliban, and it's the head of its interior ministry. He's an Al-Qaeda leader, as the UN calls him. The links between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda run deep. Those links aren't just with the Haqqanis, there are other key Taliban subgroups that have close ties to Al-Qaeda. The Islamic State, it appears to be making a comeback in Iraq and Syria. We all witnessed this over the last 2 weeks with the Al-Sina prison break. This should open our eyes to the rising threat. Al-Qaeda, prior to the Islamic State, it was part of Al-Qaeda. And in Iraq, it replenished its ranks using very similar operations after the U.S. surge ended in 2011. So after the U.S. exited Iraq, the Islamic State, or Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, began targeting prisons inside of Iraq. They began conducting operations just like we saw in Al-Sina, and they replenished their ranks. And within 3 years, they were in control of a territory in Iraq and Syria the size of Britain. Iran and Pakistan, the world's two largest state sponsors of terrorism, even though Pakistan isn't officially called that, they should be. It should be. They've won in Afghanistan. Pakistan's support for the Taliban is well known. Iran's less so. I recently testified in federal court in a trial where U.S. service members who were wounded or family members of those killed sued Iran for its support for the Taliban. I can tell you that support is significant. Iran provided the Taliban safe havens, weapons, finances, and training. Both countries remain a premier state, the world's premier state sponsor of terrorism. And this is something we ignore at our own peril. I have a graphic that shows Iran, how it shelters top Al-Qaeda leaders. This graphic is from US designations that began during the Obama administration and continued under the Trump administration. These leaders have been designated by State and Treasury Department. And also I believe it was the Treasury Department detailed this is a direct quote, a secret deal, end quote, between Iran and the Taliban that allowed, Iran and Al-Qaeda that allowed Al-Qaeda to operate inside of Iran in exchange for Al-Qaeda not targeting Iranian interests. This agreement remains in effect to today. It's mentioned in the 2021 State Department's country reports on terrorism. Again, this isn't something that just came from the Trump administration or the Bush administration. It was detailed under the Obama administration, and that report was issued by the Biden administration. Somalia and Mali are in danger of becoming the next Afghanistan. Jihad in the West and Sub-Saharan Africa is blossoming. Meanwhile, we are rudderless and devoid of leadership in this war. The desire to end the so-called endless wars has spanned 3 administrations. When your number one goal is to disengage, your enemy has the initiative. We've lost the initiative for years. We've pretended our enemies aren't our enemies, such as the Taliban. And we've refused to recognize links between our enemies because it was politically expedient to do so. 20 years after 9/11, we still can't properly define our enemies or recognize our enemies' goals and objectives. Afghanistan is case in point here. We wanted to leave Afghanistan. That the desired policy was to leave. We pretended the Taliban wasn't our enemy. We pretended that the Taliban wasn't linked to Al-Qaeda. And then we witnessed that horrific withdrawal over the summer. The Taliban is now back in control. Al-Qaeda now has safe haven. We must have accountability, especially from our military and intelligence leadership. Again, Afghanistan, case in point. There is numerous instances where the U.S. military has failed and not a single commander has paid a price for this. Until we have accountability, we will not be able to succeed in this war. And if you think that what happened in Afghanistan remains in Afghanistan, you haven't been paying attention. Our military leadership, our intelligence leadership, they are going to have to deal with threats such as China and Russia. And the lessons they have learned over the last 2 decades is that accountability is not an issue for them. And these are the people that may have to deal with crises in the Ukraine or China. We should all be worried about that. And thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. I thank the witnesses for their testimony. I remind each member that he or she will have 5 minutes to question the witnesses. I'll now recognize myself for questions. Mr. Greenblatt, the United States faces increasingly complex and dynamic threat landscape where misinformation like QAnon or anti-Semitic conspiracies have stoked violent acts and spread at lightning speed through social media. What obligations, if any, do you believe online platforms have to minimize the spread of disinformation and misinformation that has homeland or national security implications?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the question. If we are trying to understand why is the threat environment so different today than in previous years or decades or even generations, I would posit that some of what the prior panelist was talking about, the exogenous environment, has something to do with that. And I would also get back to what Professor Idris Miller talked about in terms of the rise of these domestic extremists for various reasons. But make no mistake, the social media services have been a superhighway for extremists and hateful organizations. They have allowed them to move, Mr. Chairman, with lightning speed from the margins to the mainstream. Literally, extremists promoting hateful ideas about African Americans, about American Jews, about Muslims, about immigrants, Latinos, LGBTQ, I could go on and on and on, have exploited the lack of any liability at these companies and leveraged their platforms to push out the kind of hate that could never find its way on any mainstream media platforms. And the loophole in the law created by Section 230 and the lack of any moral leadership from these businesses has helped to create this problem. Now, Mr. Chairman, it is both a matter that is an issue that matters to Americans on an individual basis and on a systemic basis. On an individual basis, ADL tracks hate and harassment online every year. And every year we see in our latest survey, which came out in 2021, roughly 41% of users of social media report being harassed online, and 28% report being victimized by serial, sustained harassment. Mr. Chairman, these are children who often find themselves deluged with white supremacist content. And it's not just happening on the social media service. The gaming platforms are a problem. And I got to tell you, as Facebook, which is the place where it happens the most, Mr. Chairman, moves into the metaverse, they seem to be unwilling to do the basics on their current platform, which means you can better believe the metaverse will be filled with even worse issues than what we see right now. Mr. Chairman, if you did one thing as a committee, one thing, focus on the social media companies, hold them accountable for what they're doing, that will be a game changer to mitigate the rise of extremism in America and really around the world.
Thank you. Speaking of platforms, Mr. Rasmussen, you talked a little bit about it, and can you, in short order, and I know this is a challenge, tell us what these companies ought to be doing to help us identify this content?
Sure, Mr. Chairman. And again, in my role at GiftCT, I work with the companies to bring them together to try to develop cross-platform solutions, because the environment that Jonathan described is one in which material or these hateful ideologies can migrate and spread across multiple platforms and create much greater impact and reach. And it's just very difficult to contain once those kinds of toxic ideologies are spreading through that environment. So one of the things we're trying to do at GiftCT is to find ways for the companies to cooperate with each other, to share information across their platforms so that when something appears on one of them that is of concern to others of them, that they can act on it more quickly, particularly in a crisis management or crisis response scenario, such as we saw with Colleyville 2 weekends ago. Each of the companies has their own platform rules, terms of service, policies that they enforce, and they should be engaged on those policies, rules, and terms of service on their own terms as companies. We don't HFCT set those rules, policies, or terms of service. But what we do try to do is together make us more effective as an industry in managing this online environment and to trying to better identify when it is that this online activity actually translates into real world harm. Because at the end of the day, this is, as your committee knows, about keeping Americans safe. And so we've got to find better ways to figure out when it is that this activity online actually goes further and takes the next step, which is actual violence.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was having technical difficulties unmuting myself, and some of you probably would wish that I would stay muted. But I appreciate Mr. Greenblatt right off the bat. I got to tell you, your passion is exactly what your organization needs. And I've worked with groups all my years as a prosecutor because of the anti-Semitic violence. And I just want to make a quick observation that everything you said, I agree with, and what the testimony that the chairman elicited from you, I agree with. And I also think one of the components that we have in this country now is absolutely irresponsible rhetoric from leaders in politics and leaders in communities, and even people such as celebrities like we've not seen in the last couple of days. I think all that helps contribute to this ignorance and misinformation, which then fuels bad acts. So I think it's incumbent upon us to have that holistic discussion at some point as well, you know. But I do applaud what you're doing. And the only thing I can tell you is keep going, because when I was a prosecutor back in Syracuse, one of my best friends, I went to law school with, of Jewish heritage, was inspired to get involved in law enforcement because of a firebombing of a temple in Syracuse. And so it's a long problem, but my biggest concern is it's on the rise. And everything you said, we got to think about, but we've got to really hammer people when they engage in irresponsible rhetoric, because I think it's really important.
I would just respond, Mr. Katko, Mr. Congressman, by saying, number one, how much we appreciate your service, your work as a prosecutor in upstate New York, and your service in Congress. And I regret that you're retiring because you've been such an important moral voice in so many ways. I'll also thank you for the kind words. Look, I mean, we have to be passionate. I once had a social media executive say to me, "Why are you so emotional about this issue?" And my response was, "Why are you not more emotional about this issue?" I just need to clarify something that my very good friend Nick said just a moment before me. And I want all of you to hear this. There is a clear causal relationship. And I could show you the screenshots where we've seen white supremacist groups, radical Islamist groups organizing on these platforms, whether it's in public places like Facebook groups or private services like Telegram and Signal, or even in the dark web making threats, and then it turns into real world violence. I could tell you about how the shooter in Pittsburgh posted a manifesto and he was communicating on, I think it was Gab or Discord, and said, "I'm going in." And then he shot and killed 11 people in a synagogue, or the manifesto that the guy in Poway posted. So this is real. And Mr. Chairman and Congressman Katko, please do not let the social media companies tell you they just can't get their arms around this. These are the most profitable, most innovative, most technologically capable companies in the United States or the world. Like Facebook has built the most sophisticated advertising platform in the history of capitalism. It's hard to build a business that generates $100 billion a year. You know what's not so hard? Knocking off the Nazis. So it literally is treating us like dummies to say that they don't have the means to deal with this.
I agree with that, and thank you very much. And I may be leaving, but I'm too much of a loudmouth to shut up the rest of my life. I'll be involved in this the rest of my life. That I promise you. Mr. Roggio, I wanted to speak with you for a moment. I appreciate your testimony as well. And I'm vitally concerned about Afghanistan and the vacuum that's been left there. And so from the intel surveillance and reconnaissance standpoint, have there been significant shortfalls since we left Afghanistan? And talk about that, and talk about the over the horizon, which I think is a failure to admit the lack of an intel, and what's going on with respect to Afghanistan, and what does it mean for the homeland?
Yes, sir. Thank you. It's a pertinent question. It's one of the most important questions to be asked here today when on the international aspect, the jihadist aspect of this. In mid-December, General McKenzie was quoted as saying that the U.S. capabilities, ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities inside Afghanistan was reduced to 1 to 2% of its previous capabilities when the U.S. was in country. Keep in mind that when the military says something like this, they're giving the most optimistic perspective on this. So what we're talking about here is that ISR capabilities have been reduced to nearly zero. So that what that means in layman's terms is we can't find and observe terrorists who are operating in not just in Afghanistan. This also applies to Pakistan as well. Keep in mind the raid to kill Osama bin Laden was launched from Afghanistan. Intelligence was gathered. Intelligence was gathered largely from units that were operating inside of Afghanistan across the border. So the idea that we can conduct over-the-horizon strikes and effectively target Al-Qaeda and allied groups, as well as the Islamic State, which really is a tertiary threat in the region. The Islamic State has been overhyped, and Al-Qaeda has been underrepresented when it comes to how the threat has metastasized in the region. The reason being is that Al-Qaeda and the Taliban are in bed together. They are virtually indistinguishable in some regards, and the Taliban gives Al-Qaeda safe haven. So if we don't have the ability to observe what they're doing, it becomes increasingly difficult to conduct those so-called over-the-horizon strikes. And the ability to carry out over-the-horizon strikes, I actually call it over-the-horizons horizon. We don't have bases in any countries to conduct such strikes. The stands, the Hbcus, Hbcus, Turkmenistan, aren't going to base the U.S. I mean, if you're them, why would you base U.S. forces in your country after the U.S. abandoned Afghanistan? Iran obviously isn't going to do it. Pakistan, they played that game and they don't want to do this any longer. So the U.S. would have to launch these strikes from carriers or long-range bombers or drones that were flown from outside. So you have poor intelligence, right? That takes time to gather. You can't keep eyes on your target. And then the platform that you're going to launch your strike from is coming from a long distance. It's a recipe for failure. We saw failure of intelligence in Kabul on August 29th when the U.S. launched that strike against the purported Islamic State planner who wound up being a civilian. That's what happened when we were in country. These mistakes happen. Think of the mistakes that can happen when you have, at best, 1 to 2% visibility, and the platforms you're using to launch the strikes are far outside the borders of Afghanistan.
Thank you, Mr. Roach. I appreciate it. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your indulgence.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ranking Member. That was a professional courtesy you received.
I know.
It will not be extended to any other member. We will adhere to the 5-minute time. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for this hearing along with the ranking member. Let me quickly go into my line of questioning by, first of all, saying to Mr. Rasmussen that I have the passion, and the members of this committee and our chairman and ranking member have the passion, and we are very grateful for your testimony. I want to emphasize where we are today by referring to the FBI's comment about the salad bowl. And I want to offer my deepest sympathy again for my friends in Colleyville, the horrific terrorist act, and I'm glad that the FBI corrected its language. It was domestic terrorism, it was terrorism. And of course, January 6th and the big lie, and the Boogaloo movement, along with the enormity of domestic terrorists who are growing every day. And you're right, it is being fueled by our social media. Although I want to emphasize as well, a First Amendment protection. So social media ran ads in the last 2 months, pretty ads introducing their content people and saying, we want the federal government to give us our directions, our guidance, our laws. Can you be specific as relates to these mega sites as to what you would like us to do very quickly. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Actually, I'm not sure I can be specific because I don't speak for tech companies in terms of what they would want to see from a new legislative framework. Each of the companies will have their own view on the wisdom of particular pieces of legislation, and we don't take an organizational view in that regard. I will say, though, that when companies in the past have been dealing with issues like terrorism and violent extremism online, they benefit from clarity when it comes from definitional frameworks or prescribing of groups so that they know clearly and unambiguously what content can be deemed illegal by the federal government, for example. In the case of the GIF-CT, we operate with our hash sharing database using the a UN list of global terrorists and global terrorist organizations. That is a way for us to rely on a framework that is transparent, visible to all, and doesn't involve kind of random decision-making inside companies. So,
thank you.
Ma'am, I'm not sure I can give you more than that.
Thank you. Mr. Greenblatt, let me ask you the same question and how we can be effective on helping to ensure that there is responsiveness. Let me comment on my desires. I sit on the Judiciary Committee, and Homeland works very carefully overlapping on some of these issues. I frankly believe the FBI should become more intense. There should be more funding. There should be a larger section dealing with domestic terrorism, and as well having a component that deals with what is happening on these sites. Mr. Greenblatt, would you respond, please?
Well, thank you, Congresswoman, for the question. Look, the ADL has said time and time again that the social media companies are fully aware of what's going on. So I will, and they know. And one of the outcomes or the insights from the whistleblower, her revelations last summer, Madam Congresswoman, was that we learned that Facebook was tracking everything. Frankly, Madam Congresswoman, they knew more. It was worse than we thought, and they knew it all along. So I will credit the Algorithmic Justice and Online Transparency Act that would prevent or at least prohibit harmful and discriminatory algorithms, among other measures. I mean, we need legislation like that and others to address online hate immediately, because we have to keep in mind, big tech's business model optimizes for engagement, and hateful, racist, anti-Semitic content is highly engaging. Therefore, it is, amplified by the algorithms. And while I deeply believe in freedom of speech, Congresswoman, let's keep in mind, freedom of speech is not freedom of reach. So the companies are making a decision when they privilege that information. They don't have to publish it.
And you can't cry fire in a crowded theater. I am truly with
Exactly.
you. I will accept your challenge and we'll be working with you. Mr. Chairman, I want to add into the record an article from the Washington Post that indicates the heinous acts of bomb threats to historically Black colleges as unanimous consent. I'd like to read into the record: Rusk College, Tougaloo College, Jackson State, Alcorn, Mississippi Valley State, Fort Valley University, Spelman, Morgan State, Coppin State University, Harris Stowe State University, Missouri, Kentucky State, Xavier, Philander Smith, Edward Waters, Howard University, which is having a bomb threat right now. This is a crisis, and I want to join with my colleague for legislation dealing with our social media, but as well, I'm going to ask that the officials from Homeland Security, in collaboration with the FBI, develop a deeper dive, a much more intense area of focus on domestic terrorism. We have to stop it. Lives are being lost, and it is absolutely untenable for this to continue. Thank you so very much, Mr. Chairman.
The latest time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the ranking member as well for holding this hearing. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to abandon my planned line of questioning because I've been quite startled by some of the testimony here today. Dr. Cynthia Miller Idris, am I pronouncing your last name properly, ma'am? Idris?
It's Idris, but it's fine either way.
Idris.
Thank you. Yes.
Yes, ma'am. Well, the right way is the right way. So, Dr. Idris, respectfully, I listened to your testimony. I felt that you painted quite a dystopian image of America's future. It seems like you're promoting positions that are quite contrary to the fundamental values that have made America great. And I say this respectfully. I'm sincerely curious as to your response. Do you believe that Americans should live free of government oppression?
Of course, I believe. I mean, I believe very much in the. Thank you for the question, of course, Mr. Higgins, and I do believe that you know, our fundamental rights and protections, including freedom of speech and assembly, are. I mean, what I'm talking about is equipping people with skills to make decisions that lead them to be less manipulated.
Okay, well,
by bad actors.
let's engage a little bit about this,
Sure.
because to me, you presented a future of America with a great deal of Big Brother type government surveillance. You used a term that I had to look up called heteronormativity. Do you believe heteronormativity is a threat?
That term
Legitimate question.
from a research report that is talking about the beliefs of Salafi jihadists and accelerationists, neo-Nazis and neo-fascists. So
Yeah, well, as it relates to American government interaction in the lives of the citizenry that we serve, that Americans, we intend to live free, we intend to communicate freely, we intend to communicate freely across any platforms, we intend to travel the land freely.
of course,
Some of us believe in American exceptionalism and America first policy. Do you believe, Doctor, that American exceptionalism as a core belief, you think that's a threat? You find that threatening?
I think that when I was talking about those components of the salad bar or the blurred ideologies, what I'm talking about are ideas that are inspiring hateful and terrorist acts. In
hateful as
but not
determined
from the government.
by whom?
By Salafi jihadists and neo-fascists. That's what that research was referring to, by extremist and terrorist groups, not about, this is not about, those terms were not referring to any components of legitimate mainstream governments or policies. Those are referring to the ideologies of extremist groups, not, so just to be clear, sorry, I was citing that prior research.
Well, yes, but extremist groups, Americans are being identified as members of extremist groups on this committee that's being openly discussed here today. Americans expressing free thought are being categorized as hateful Americans, and it's incredible to me that language describing international terrorists who have identified themselves as contrary to the best interest of American citizens and America's future, have sworn to bring us down and to either convert us or destroy us. It's incredible to me that Americans expressing free thought across any platforms could be associated or equivocated with foreign national terrorists.
Well, I think
that
when we're
wish to
talking
destroy
about
our country.
Sure,
You also
yes.
mentioned, I just want to ask you this before my time is
Sure.
up. You mentioned early interventions. Should the government intervene in the life of children being raised by parents and households that have particular principles, religious principles, including Christian principles?
I do not believe the government should be involved in any of the ideological
Thank you.
beliefs of Americans.
Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate you clarifying some of your statement. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, thank you very much. I yield.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Rhode Island for 5 minutes, Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses today for their very sobering testimony on a very troubling issue. Anti-Semitism is something to be taken extremely seriously. And today's testimony has really underscored the alarming degree to which individuals can be radicalized by misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, and motivated to commit extremist acts. And I'm concerned that this burgeoning digital extremism, along with the increasing availability of hacking tools and malware as a service business models, could together increase the motivations and lower the technical threshold required for acts of cyber-enabled terrorism and sabotage against U.S. infrastructure. And I'm also concerned about the prospects of organized terrorist groups specifically recruiting to increase their capacity for malicious cyber activity targeting U.S. persons, communities, institutions, and infrastructure. So if I could start with Mr. Rasmussen, what capabilities, in your opinion, exist for the government and multi-stakeholder community to analyze and share information about cyber-specific terrorist threats to the United States? And I also want to ask, have observers identified pervasive online narratives or coordinated misinformation campaigns intended to encourage cyber attacks against U.S. persons, institutions, or infrastructure?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Langevin. I mean, we've long known that, and this goes back actually more to my time in government service more than my current role, but we've long known that terrorist organizations, including some of the ones we've talked about in this hearing today, have the aspiration to carry out aggressive cyber operations against Western countries, to include the United States. They've often not matched that aspiration with genuine capability. And so I think that's something our intelligence community watches and monitors very carefully to see when that intention might translate into real capability. From the technology company perspective, the companies that I work with, we work very closely with them to try to understand adversarial shifts, when particular terrorist organizations are moving in a particular direction, so that companies can be aware and then be on the front foot to act against that activity. We lean into the academic world to help us do that, because again, so much of this conversation among extremists and terrorists takes place in the open source world. Why don't I stop there?
Okay, good, thank you. And I want to ask, what about efforts among established or burgeoning extremist groups to recruit cyber talent to commit malicious cyber acts? Have you seen anything at that degree which is of concern to the committee?
Again, I draw more on my government experience when I was in the classified world, where that was a real phenomenon, Mr. Langevin. Obviously, as the cadre of violent extremists and terrorists becomes younger, they are, of course, more digitally literate and more digitally savvy. And so the kind of pool of recruits or adherents to those extremist ideologies who are available for that kind of work on behalf of a terrorist organization is a bigger pool than perhaps we saw in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, for example. So I would imagine that is a growing concern for my colleagues in government.
Before my time expires, let me ask, we can answer this for all of our witnesses. How can Congress support ongoing multi-stakeholder efforts to better understand and analyze the spread of radicalizing mis- and disinformation and extremist ideologies? Likewise, what opportunities are there for Congress to support ongoing proposed initiatives to promote societal resilience against mis- and disinformation? We can start with one of our other witnesses and go until the time runs out.
I can weigh in. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, please.
I can weigh in very quickly just to say thank you for the question, Mr. Langevin. I think that when we're talking about a multi-stakeholder needs, what we see in other countries is often on these issues, we have 9 to 12 agencies involved. We really need, at the very minimum, some sort of commission that brings in not just security and intelligence experts, but also educational, social work, health and human services, youth experts, people who really understand what makes for this kind of vulnerability and how people become susceptible to and can be dissuaded from those types of beliefs, in addition to tech experts, et cetera. I don't think we can solve this just with the very important lens of law enforcement and security.
Very good. Thank you. I see my time's expired, so Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Greenblatt, your policy recommendations in your testimony go under the rubric PROTECT, an acronym for a number of suggestions. And included among them is to oppose extremists in government service. And then there's detail on this point on page 14 that says the ban should be extended to individuals engaged in violent extremist activity. And I'd be surprised if anybody would disagree with that. Some might want to be careful to limit that, though, to those who've engaged in serious violence and not inadvertently extend it to, for example, Scott Smith, arrested at the Loudoun County School Board meeting after officials denied from the podium that his 9th grade daughter had been raped and sodomized in a bathroom at school. But first, do you say that someone like that example I just gave, should be barred from federal, state, or local public service?
Well, Mr. Congressman, thank you for the question. And I might just say, to start this off, how much I appreciate Dr. Miller Idris for her leadership and her research on all of these issues. So thank you, Dr. Miller Idris. So, Mr. Congressman, I don't know the specifics of this gentleman at the school board, but I absolutely think if you're involved in a white supremacist group, if you're involved in a group that threatens to overthrow the U.S. government, you should not
about that one instance,
law enforcement.
Mr. Greenblatt, what about that? The one I just gave the example of, someone who was arrested for resisting because he had something like that happen from the dais at a public meeting.
I don't know anything about this person, Mr. Congressman, and his background.
So you're not prepared to say that person should not be barred from federal, state, or local service?
Yeah, I really don't know enough to say, but the situation with his daughter sounds horrible.
Beyond that, you recommend that those associated with violent extremist movements should be barred, and you applaud the DHS announcement that it will vet employees for, quote, extremist sympathies.
Yep.
So you recommend barring not only the violent, nor even those who sympathize with the violent, but those who sympathize with movements that are associated with violence. Is that right?
Sure. So if you have Nazi tattoos or if you have KKK tattoos, I think that should be a disqualifier. Yes, I do believe that.
Okay. How do you propose it be decided what it means for a movement to be associated with violence, or whether a person sympathizes with the violent acts of a movement as opposed to its nonviolent views?
Well, Mr. Congressman, I would ask you, if you had an intern who showed up with Nazi tattoos on his neck, would you think that person was qualified to represent you in your office in the United States Congress?
Okay, let me ask you something. Maybe we can make it a little bit tougher than that obvious example.
Okay.
You take extremism. On your website, it says it's a concept used to describe religious, social, or political belief systems that exist substantially outside of belief systems more broadly accepted in society, i.e. mainstream beliefs. So it's something out of the mainstream. It goes on beyond that, but it comes to this sentence, which is interesting. Not every extremist movement is bad. The abolitionist movement is one example of an extreme movement that had admirable goals. But most extremist movements exist outside of the mainstream because many of their views or tactics are objectionable. All right, here's another example, Mr. Greenblatt. Women's suffrage, too, was an extremist movement at one time, correct?
I don't know if I would characterize it that way, but it's certainly out of the mainstream in its earliest days, yes.
Out of the mainstream. And there were proponents of it who used violence. Are you aware of that?
No, I'm not aware of that.
Okay, so I was reading a book on Winston Churchill. They threw bricks at him. There was a bombing or two. This is in Europe, and I don't know all the details of it here. So how would you then say that anybody who was associated with women's suffrage would be then barred from, or sympathized with it, would be barred from government service?
Well, I certainly think if you believe it's appropriate to bomb government buildings or to assault prime ministers, you shouldn't be in government service, yes.
So, I'm asking for something a little more refined than that. Okay. Someone who sympathizes with the women's suffrage movement, and then some people who are advocates of women's suffrage or activists for it, engaged in some violence. Does that mean the person who sympathizes with the movement should be barred from government service?
Well, I most definitely think if you are unable to disassociate yourself with movements that espouse violence or supremacy of any group, yes, you should be barred from government service. You can support women's suffrage and not support harming government officials.
Sure. I think what you're posing is easy. What's hard is, how do you say that, or who judges and by what standard whether they have adequately disassociated themselves with the violent acts of some extremists associated with the movement, but not the broader goals of a movement?
It's a fair question. So again, if we talk about Al Qaeda, we talk about ISIS, we talk about some of the horrific anti-Israel people out there who say the Jewish state is committing genocide. You know, Mr. Congressman, I don't think they belong as interns in your office or any public office for that matter. That's just, I feel very strongly about that. That kind of extremism should have no place.
I join you, sir. I think the problem is at the margins, you raise a lot of very difficult questions, and you pose the possibility of imposing very significantly on fundamental constitutional freedoms. And your recommendation does not include much of a roadmap in terms of how to separate that out. My time has expired, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Correa, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you help me okay? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and our ranking member. In 2017, white nationalists marched in the Unite the Right rally and flooded our television screens with images of neo-Nazism and Klan paraphernalia. The result, 1 person killed and 35 injured. Following the attack in Charlottesville, I was the first member of Congress to call for action, to demand action. Any American lost, whether here or overseas, is a tragedy. It's a crime, and we have to act as Congress and as a nation. We continue to have these issues over and over again in our country. And today, this is an important issue because as much as we want things to get better, I just don't feel in my heart, in my gut, that this country is coming together. I know that we continue to have hate speech, hate ideology, and social media continues to be the breeding ground for this kind of thought. So my question to all the panelists today, when it comes to social media, Section 230, immunity, responsibility, liability, what are your thoughts? Mr. Roggio.
Unmute yourself. You need to unmute yourself.
My apologies. It's a very good question. You know, the question, we all know what the easy answer to hate speech is, but what is the difference? What happens when political speech that you disagree with becomes defined as hate speech? Who defines what is hate speech? This is where I have very grave concerns. I realize this is a little bit out of the area of my expertise here, but I certainly have a very strong opinion on this, and I know this from looking at what jihadist groups are doing. And, you know, it's a fine line to say, you know, here's an idea that I disagree with, and this is actually hate speech. Who gets to be the gatekeeper to define what is and isn't hate speech?
But at the same time, we do need to make some value judgments. Mr. Greenblatt, thoughts?
Thank you for asking me the question. So publishers make these decisions every day, Mr. Congressman, from the New York Times to Newsweek to NBC to every which way because they have liability concerns. I'm going to credit Congressman Malinowski, who I believe is on this committee, and Congressman Ashew. They're Protecting Americans from Dangerous Algorithms Act, removes immunity from liability when the algorithms amplify recommended content. Okay, so there is just no question that you can say there's always been a lunatic fringe, Mr. Congressman. We just need to keep them on the fringe. And I think the Malinowski Act would go a long way to removing liability when algorithms bring it onto the fringe. Just make the companies play by the same rules that every other media company in America plays by, and that will take care of the issue.
Mr. Greenblatt, let me focus right now on that specific question. Separation, definition, at what point does that freedom of speech essentially translate into yelling fire in a crowded theater? What point do you cross that line? How do you see that?
The way I see it is the companies have to make decisions about what voices they choose to privilege and publish, just like, you know, you're in Anaheim, I think. The Anaheim Bee has to decide what articles it puts or what essay they put on the op-ed page, and they make decisions, or what letters they publish. They make those decisions every day, Mr. Congressman, with great effectiveness. And if you can't get your letter published in the Anaheim Bee, then you can go do it somewhere else. So the same rule should apply here.
Let me say that I concur with you, because you know hate speech when you see it, so to speak. When you read an op-ed, when you write something that is clearly designed to incite hate, anger, violence, you know it's wrong. And I'm hoping we as a legislative body are able to come up with some rules and a strong message to social media saying this cannot be tolerated, respecting the First Amendment, but this kind of hateful division, the speech that divides our nation, cannot be tolerated.
Just make them liable, Mr. Congressman. Just make them liable and it'll change overnight.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm out of time. I yield.
Chairman yields back. Chair recognizes gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Van Drew, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Thompson and Ranking Member Katko, and thank you to the witnesses for testifying today. Dr. Miller-Idris, in your report, you go into great detail about how far-right terrorism and violent extremism are escalating rapidly across the United States and how they pose a severe threat to our country's democracy. I read through your entire 13-page testimony and could not help but notice that not once, not one single time, did you mention Antifa, Black Lives Matters, or any other leftist extremist organization or movement, and their contributions to political violence and political unrest. Your own definition of terrorism included in your written testimony is, quote, the use of violence in order to intimidate or coerce civilians or influence the policies of government. You did not discuss these organizations. Coordinated efforts which led to the federal courthouse damage in Portland, Oregon during the summer of 2020, during which 18 rioters were arrested, or the $50 million worth of damage that left rioters caused to the city of Kenosha, Wisconsin in the year 2020. You also did not address the fact that the co-founder of Black Lives Matters, who is a self-proclaimed Marxist, has publicly called for the destruction of the nuclear family and the structure of the nuclear family and the national defunding of police, and has used the organization to promote its policies using violence on multiple occasions. Can you please help me understand what part of these groups' actions have been unworthy of your attention? And can you explain to me on this committee whether you think any of these examples constitute or contribute to violent extremism?
Thank you, Mr. Van Drew, for the question. I do think that we have to be concerned about rising violence from the far left as well as from the far right. I believe the FBI's testimony earlier last year indicated that there were 800 investigations into criminal activity related to the summer of 2020 protests, and that there have been 250 arrests. And I think that those figures are important. I think the CSIS data has also shown trending upward violence coming from the far left that we should be pay attention to, given the history in which in the 1970s, of course, far-right terrorism was the predominant form of terrorism. And we know that because of evolving trends, these things can change at any time. I focus on the far right in my testimony, or these terms are one of the terminology issues I think that Mr. Bishop raised, is that we don't really have a good universal definition of extremism, even across our own agencies. But one of the reasons why I focus on the far right here is because both under the Trump administration, the Department of Homeland Security, and then the Office of the Director of National Intelligence after the January 6th events, declared that unlawful militia movements and white supremacist extremists pose the most lethal and pressing threat to the nation from within the domestic violent extremism spectrum. So to the extent, as long as that data is there, that's where we have to focus our efforts on the domestic side, of course.
I thank you for that. I would just maintain that in general, that we be fair and even-handed at how we look at this, because there are problems on both sides. I'm not saying there aren't problems, but those problems exist on both sides. And I think we should deal with that in a fair and even-handed way. And Mr. Greenblatt, something that comes to mind with me, because whenever government steps in and takes people's rights away, it's a very tender and sensitive issue. It's really difficult. It's not easy because our rights are so very important. And no, I wouldn't hire somebody with Nazi symbols going down their neck or anything of that nature. And either would you, I think either would anybody on this panel. But the real quick question I have for you is, how about somebody who really believes in Black Lives Matters or even in what Antifa did, but otherwise has a good record? What would you do with them?
Well, look, I got to be honest. You're entirely correct, Mr. Congressman. Violence is not the sole domain of any one extremist movement. It's an issue across the spectrum. And the people who would burn down stores and the people who would deface government buildings, the people who would commit these acts, they need to be identified, arrested, and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. And no, I wouldn't hire an Antifa enthusiast as an intern or as an employee at ADL, to be perfectly honest with you. I don't know that any have ever applied, but I certainly would not want anyone espousing violence in my organization. Period. End of story.
Okay, thank you. I'm glad to see that. It seems that hopefully maybe we're on close to a same page on that. I just would like equal attention given to both. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired.
yield back.
Still recognize the gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Slotkin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for our witnesses joining us. I've been listening to the conversation, and as someone who's a former CIA analyst and Pentagon official, I spent my time focusing on foreign terrorist organizations, particularly from the Middle East, including Al-Qaeda. And it just seems like when we're talking about foreign terrorist organizations and the use of violence against American citizens abroad or threatening our homeland, there's significant agreement on the need to prevent that and frankly, on the extreme work that continues to go on largely below the headline level by our intelligence community, by our military, by a whole bunch of folks who have never taken their eye off the ball. And I'm conscious that we haven't had another major attack after 9/11, which still is kind of amazing to me. But the minute we start talking about threats to American citizens inside our own borders, it becomes deeply political. And I think the thing that I guess affects me as a CIA officer is that we have to go by the data. And while folks like Mr. Van Drew are talking about an even-handed approach, I have no problem if a group on the left is using violence, go after them. But the data reflects, the data from like the director of the FBI, not some group that's political, that the vast majority of those cases of domestic terrorism are coming from the far right. And they are mixing, many of them, not all, many of them are mixing their ideology with anti-Semitism and white supremacy. So I guess I'm concerned that it feels like such a hard thing to talk about threats to American citizens because they're Americans perpetrating the attacks. It's still a threat to safety. According to the head of the FBI, it's a bigger threat than foreign domestic terrorism right now. So I just felt like I needed to say that. That said, the similarities between extremists and this ladder of escalation that they climb from being kind of regular old Joe to feeling like they need to commit violence against another group or another person is strikingly similar between foreign terrorists and domestic terrorists. That ladder of escalation. Social media, like you said, I think, Jonathan, is rocket fuel on that climb up that ladder. My question is this, as someone who comes from a state with a lot of militia problems, extremism problems, many who were arrested participating in January 6th, has anyone seen anything that works that deprograms people and takes someone who threatens violence against another person or another group and gets them from that to back to healthy American citizen in a multi-ethnic place? I never saw it successfully done on the foreign terrorism side. So starting maybe with Mr. Rasmussen and then going to Cynthia and Jonathan, please tell me, is there a model that works? Because this is like affecting our communities at the grassroots level.
Thanks, Congresswoman Slotkin. Thank you. It's great to see you, and I'm happy to try to contribute to this conversation. When dealing with social media companies or technology platforms, we always tend to focus on what they should be stopping or taking down or preventing on their platforms. And of course, that makes sense for all the reasons we've been talking about. But some of the work we're doing at GIFCT brings those same companies together to talk about how to better structure positive interventions online to try to intervene in that cycle, that radicalization process that you just described. And that needs to be, to your point, a data-driven effort, because you can wing it and not necessarily know that you're achieving results. And so one of the things we're trying to do is bring companies together, bring the academic community into that conversation, and begin with a research-driven agenda that tells us, okay, what works? How can you redirect someone? What kind of platform intervention? Is it an ad placed off to the side that says, if you need help, call this number, or if you feel disenfranchised or at odds with the society you live in, reach out for help in this way. The prevention architecture might be what we need to think about here.
Yeah, and I know I went long, so I'm gonna ask that Mr. Greenblatt and Ms. Miller-Idris just send me, if you have any good data, to send me, because I'm frankly very interested in that. I just would say on the social media companies, is it true that the more extreme the article on the right or the left, the more clicks it gets? And therefore, these companies do not want to take this content down because it gets them more clicks and more engagement.
I'll volunteer. It is true. If it bleeds, it leads. We learn from social media, right? And so clicks are driven, Congressman Slotkin, by the most sensationalist, scary, terrifying content. And it travels far and wide. Change the business model, you would change the behavior. Make them liable for what they promote, you would change the behavior.
Thank you. I know my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentlelady's time has expired. Chair recognizes gentleman from Mississippi for 5 minutes, Mr. Guest. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Iowa, Ms. Miller-Meeks. Unmute yourself.
I did, it just didn't unmute, or I clicked too much and it remuted. But thank you very much, Chair Thompson and Mr. Roggio. During the Biden administration's incompetent, disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, as a 24-year military member, I don't know what else to call that, they described the Taliban as a partner in its retreat. And it came to light that U.S. officials gave the Taliban a list of names of American citizens, green card holders, and Afghan allies to grant entry into the militant-controlled outer perimeter of Kabul's airport, naively putting our allies and friends at the mercy of a terrorist organization if they did not get into the perimeter and get evacuated. What impact did this have on Afghans who were left behind?
Yeah, this was a horrific decision amongst the many horrific decisions. And yes, as a former military person, and every person in the military I have spoken to who was not involved with the withdrawal, it was indeed, has been characterized as a debacle. We can see it as the Taliban immediately took control of the country, was taking control of the country as we were drawing down. It was a direct causation. We leave, the Taliban take control. The decision to hand over names was horrific. I was involved with helping American citizens get out of Afghanistan, as well as Afghans who have helped us in country. So people who were vetted, who had the special immigration visa, things of that nature, as it was happening. As a matter of fact, the day after the withdrawal, I was helping an American family of 5 with 3 small children. They tried to get to the airport 4 times. It was on the 4th try that they were able to get out. Think about dragging your 3 small children through the chaotic streets of Kabul with the Taliban prowling the streets and having to turn back from your own embassies. But the people who were there, the people who have been left, those names, the names of their family members are out there. The Taliban is currently hunting members of the military and members of the government who supported the coalition, who supported us. They are hunting our allies. The United Nations recently issued a report saying about 100 former Afghan soldiers and officials have been killed. That's the number they can confirm. I hear stories and hear, from very credible sources that these numbers is very likely in the thousands. So when we gave the names of Afghans who were working with us, who we wanted to slip past to the Taliban gets a registry. And if they didn't already know that there were individuals who were being hunted, they have that information. These people are living in fear 4+ months after the U.S. withdrawal, and they will live in fear of the Taliban coming and taking them away until either it happens or they're able to leave the country.
Yeah, and I think that underscores the point you made about trying to conduct over the horizon counterterrorism, what this does to our ability to do intelligence gathering or to do counterterrorist measures with no eyes on Iran, Russia, or the Chinese Communist Party, and then betraying our allies as well as our military and American citizens and their families in Afghanistan by this botched withdrawal, and whether or not they can trust the United States again in their word to be able to remove all of its citizens and help our partners. Myself and many other military members in a bipartisan way had been pushing the administration since earlier in the year in April to process SIVs, to begin that process of trying to get Americans, their spouses and family members, and our Afghan interpreter allies out of Afghanistan. So I think it very much underscores how we've hampered ourselves going forward in order to conduct counterterrorism, especially in the Middle East.
If I may. Oh, I'm sorry.
If I have time, Chair, Mr. Rasmussen, we've seen unprecedented increases in migrant travel patterns at the United States southwest border, including migrants from all over the world and known or suspected terrorists at a level we've never seen before, quoting former Border Patrol Chief. CBP has encountered over 2 million migrants at the border in fiscal year 21, which is another record-breaking number for the Biden administration. Courageous members of our Border Patrol are stretched thin, and criminals are taking advantage of the situation to partake in human trafficking and drug smuggling. And we know and has been documented that also terrorist organizations and transnational organizations are taking advantage of the lax border efforts. Has GIFCT noticed any correlation to digital activities by transnational criminal organizations? When we've made trips to the border, we've been notified that criminal organizations are using TikTok and other social media in order to recruit.
Thank you for the question. I'm not sure I can point to any clear trends that we've seen in the use of online engagement by individuals or groups trying to cross the southern border for nefarious purposes, but it's something we can take up with our academic network, which tracks this very closely, or tracks worldwide activity very closely. Again, often the effort is to try to figure out what platforms they're operating on, because again, they know they are at risk of scrutiny from US law enforcement when they operate on mainstream platforms.
Ladies' time has expired.
Thank you, I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Am I audible?
Well,
thank you very much. Mr. Greenblatt, I thought of you this morning. I was reading an article on how the Holocaust moved from concentration camps to Jewish victims, printed in some time ago, but still relevant. But today, I want to visit with you about this phenomenon known as the salad bar. This salad bar concept has persons who have different ideologies that will ordinarily be antithetical to each other. They can find a way to put aside their differences in ideology and work together for a common cause, a common evil cause, I might add. And this was expressed by the supremacists and the adherents to some of these ideologies related to persons who are without the country, as they talked about what happened to Jewish people. And I'm concerned about it and would like to get your opinion as to How concerned are you with reference to this, and what is the impact of this, if you would, please?
Well, look, I think when FBI Director Wray talked about the salad bar concept in his testimony, he was describing this very real phenomenon, Mr. Congressman, where in the past people were, curated in a specific movement over a long period of time, but now, thanks to social media, thanks to these different services, they can go and grab, like walking through a grocery store, and take all these crazy ideas. But there are some ideas, Mr. Congressman, that seem to be permanent in these views. Number one, there is an anti-Semitism at the beating heart of white supremacy, QAnon, accelerationism, all these other kind of movements believe that there's a cabal of Jews running the world, or they've overtaken the government. Number two, that African Americans, Black Americans, are inferior to the white race and a driver of white genocide. This is a widely held view amongst people on the far right. So it may be that Al-Qaeda and the white supremacists share this hateful view of Jews, but the racism of the white supremacists, Mr. Congressman, is something that is diabolical and deeply frightening. And these ideas just boomerang off of one another. And the third idea is that immigrants from abroad are coming here to somehow change the country. Mexicans, Muslims, people from Asia, it goes on and on. So these different ideas create a very toxic and explosive mix that we've seen lead to the murder of people. Again, I think about Texas, I think about El Paso, I think about what almost happened in Colleyville, I think about what you've had to endure in your community, and you know what I'm talking about.
Yes, sir, I do. And it would seem to me that given this phenomenon, that we have to make sure that we are together, that we don't allow lines of division to exist among people who have common enemies.
Yes.
I think that we can't silo. I can't decide that I'm just going to fight racism because that's what impacts me. At some point, there has to be this reality, this realization that the common enemy has to be addressed by people who are being impacted with a common message. We all have to have a similar message to deal with this enemy that we confront.
Absolutely. Racism is not your problem as a Black man. It's my problem too as a white man. Like anti-Semitism is just my problem as a Jew. It's your problem too as a non-Jew. So you're right. We are all in this together.
Well, I do thank you. And if you get a chance, check the article out, How the Holocaust Moved from Concentration Camps to Jewish Victims' Homes. So
I will.
Very, very powerful in the Washington Post. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Mississippi for 5 minutes, Mr. Guest.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Roger, I want to visit with you just a few moments on something that I heard you mention in your opening statement, something that was also addressed a few moments ago by Dr. Meeks, which is the withdrawal from Afghanistan. In your opening statement, I believe you said that it was a major propaganda victory. I know in the written testimony that you prepared, you referred to it as being disastrous. You go on to say that the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan led to the immediate collapse of the Afghan government and military and the swift return of power to the Taliban. You then go on to say later that the Taliban alliance with Al-Qaeda has not been broken, but in fact has been strengthened as it was forged in 20 years of war against the United States and its allies. Afghanistan is again a safe haven for Al-Qaeda. And then the following paragraph, you talk about America's abandonment of Afghanistan has created what you refer to as second and third order effects on our allies, our adversaries, and our enemies. You say America's adversaries and enemies now sense weakness, and we are seeking, and they are seeking to drive wedges between America and her allies. The desire to end the so-called endless war in Afghanistan has called into question America's commitments to its allies and its leadership on the global stage. And so what I would like to ask you and give you a few minutes to expand upon is first, the short and the long-term impacts that the Afghanistan withdrawal will have on threats to our homeland, and then more in a broader stage, the impact that this will have on America's leadership on the international stage.
Sure, I'm going to take the second question first, the impact on the international stage. American allies were deeply shaken by the U.S. withdrawal. We have, look, there's been news report after news report about how our allies were upset and felt left in the dark by the U.S. And it was a unilateral decision to withdraw. The reality is that President Biden made the decision to leave Afghanistan, and NATO allies and other allies and partners who were in Afghanistan, they were not able to maintain a presence without the U.S. So the U.S. made the decision, and they had no choice but to follow through. NATO and other countries could not stay in Afghanistan without a U.S. presence because we provided the bulk of the forces, the security, the maintaining of the large air bases, things of that nature. This is an issue, and we're seeing it developing in the Ukraine issue. We're having allies speak to Russia sidebar without the United States. In negotiations with Iran, the European countries are talking to Iran directly, and the U.S. is sidelined. This is all a direct result of countries being concerned about U.S. leadership. And as far as our adversaries and enemies go, immediately after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, this was reported in the press as well. Russia and China were issuing whisper campaigns to countries like North Korea and the Ukraine and other allies and partners of the United States. Can you count on the United States to be there for you? Look what they did to their so-called partner in Afghanistan. This could be you next. So this is the second and third order effects that I was referring to in my written testimony. As far as the short and medium long-term impact of the Afghanistan being under control of the Taliban, again, the key issue to me here is safe haven. Al-Qaeda was able to carry out and execute 9/11 because of its safe haven in Afghanistan. It was plotted, financed, and recruits were gathered. These were many of the recruits for 9/11. They were people who fought on battlefields in Afghanistan alongside the Taliban, who attended Al-Qaeda training camps. The 9/11 Commission report is very clear that safe haven is a key function. So the greater the safe haven that jihadist groups have, the greater their ability to plot and execute attacks against the U.S. homeland. Afghanistan isn't just partially controlled by the Taliban as it was pre-9/11. Remember, you had the Northern Alliance contesting controlling about 10 to 15% of the country, and in battle with the Taliban. So the Taliban and Al-Qaeda had to devote resources to fighting the Northern Alliance. That doesn't exist anymore. Now Al-Qaeda can devote its resources to launch what's called external operations. These operations may not just be directed at the U.S. homeland. These can be directed at U.S. military bases overseas, U.S. businesses overseas, or just civilians overseas. But ultimately, Al-Qaeda wants to establish a caliphate. Afghanistan is the first of many emirates or states within its caliphate. It's a massive blow to the U.S. in short term. I think what we're seeing is Al-Qaeda is organizing and sort of reaping the benefits. And it's sort of the mid and long term that I really am concerned about the Taliban's control of Afghanistan and Al-Qaeda's role in that.
No, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Swalwell, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. And I actually agree with Mr. Roggio that Afghanistan was an absolute disaster. And if this committee has time, we should have hearings on why Donald Trump, the twice impeached former president, released 5,000 Taliban troops and set such a public withdrawal date. So he and I are aligned there, Chairman. But today we're here to talk about the evolving realities of terrorist threats to the United States. And I wanted to draw the committee's attention and some of the witnesses to an article that I published last year in the Harvard Journal on Legislation titled Homeland Security 20 Years After September 11, Addressing Evolving Threats. And I laid out and proposed that domestic terrorism has become a more complex, more diverse, and more dispersed threat. And I would ask Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idris if you agree with the premise that domestic terrorism is now the largest threat to the homeland.
Yes, I believe the data on that is very clear. Thank you.
And I'd also like Mr. expertise in tracking global terrorism on the internet and its overall effect on the United States. Do you agree that we must adapt our national security focus to address anti-government extremism and white supremacy violent groups?
Yes, I think that it's imperative that we do so.
And Mr. Rasmussen?
Any ideologically driven movement that would result in violence or terrorist activity directed at innocent populations is, of course, worthy of that level of scrutiny and policy attention.
And Dr. Miller-Idriss, given what's happening in Ukraine and as Russia is amassing both cyber efforts and ground troops for a potential invasion there, what can you share about how this geopolitical conflict is being characterized by far-right violent extremist groups?
Thank you for the question. I think like any other geopolitical conflict, we see that there are potential ripple effects for terrorist actors and extremist actors. And in this case, on the white supremacist extremist side, we have already been seeing quite a bit of chatter online, including dedicated chat rooms spewing really anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about the conflict and about Ukraine's leadership being Jewish. And I think we can see the ways in which it's fueling both recruitment efforts, invitations to come train for white supremacist foreign fighters, and the potential for further instability, in fact, in other parts of the region. So it's very early. We don't know how that will all pan out. I don't want to sound overly alarmist, but I think that it's something that should be watched closely.
Mr. Greenblatt, is there value in America's leaders in condemning violent rhetoric among different groups in America that try and associate with one political party or another?
There's no question, Mr. Congressman, that we need elected officials, policymakers, and public figures of all sort to call out extremism whenever it happens. And in particular, I'll just say we need, conservative voices to call it out when it comes from the right. We need progressive voices to call it out when it comes from the left. We need Jewish voices to call it out when you hear Jewish extremism, Muslim voices, when we hear Islamist extremism. All of us have a responsibility to do this.
I agree. And it was suggested earlier that, there's not a condemnation of Antifa. And let me make it clear that I absolutely denounce Antifa. I denounce any violence used in the name of any political movement that associates with democratic politics. And I would hope that my Republican colleagues could denounce the Proud Boys and could denounce the Oath Keepers and could denounce the whatever percenters group that's out there, and also could denounce this crazy idea that the former president would give pardons to people who were at the Capitol on January 6th carrying a Confederate flag or were part of a group or a mob that killed a police officer. And so I do agree with you, Mr. Greenblatt, that it takes both sides. And I will make sure that you and others hold me accountable when there's groups on the left who engage in violence or violent rhetoric, and make sure that we loudly condemn it. And I would just invite my colleagues across the aisle to do the same, because I think we'll be safer as a country when that happens. And I'll give you the last word.
Mr. Congressman, I'll just give you a data point. ADL, we track extremist-related murders. And in the past decade, we found one Antifa adherent who was involved in a murder. And that happened in 2020. Whereas right-wing extremists have been involved in 75% of the 429, domestic extremist-related murders in the United States. Okay, domestic Islamist extremists, 20%. So just to put it in perspective, like Antifa sure is it a problem in theory, but in practice, the white nationalists, the armed militia enthusiasts, the QAnon adherents, the accelerationists, etc., these literally are a threat to the homeland in a way that dwarfs anything else.
Well said, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes gentlelady from Tennessee, Ms. Hbcus, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the witnesses for being here today. I want to start with Mr. Raggio. Throughout this Afghanistan evacuation and relocation efforts, there's been major concerns that terrorists would exploit this chaotic environment. And of course they did. On August 26, an ISIS-K affiliated suicide bomber who was released from a high security prison killed 13 of our servicemen and women. And I have a question, and I do want to preface that by telling you that the question is this: do you have a sense of where those individuals dispersed to, and how many have resumed their participation in terrorist plots around the world? And that question comes to you because in a recent hearing, I asked Secretary Mayorkas whether or not he believed these prisoners posed a threat at the southern border by illegally crossing. And he absolutely said, no, Congresswoman, I do not. So what are your thoughts of where these men have ended up?
So the answer to your question is we really don't know where they've ended up. Again, our visibility in Afghanistan has dropped to near zero. We have very little information about where the prisoners who have escaped those prisons have left. I've seen things like Osama bin Laden's former security chief, who was not detained, he was hiding in Pakistan, returned to his home in a parade that was held by the Taliban. Now, Osama bin Laden's security chief, who defended him at the Battle of Tora Bora, that's a very significant individual who's out there now. Is he back involved in Al-Qaeda's global operations? We don't know the answer to that. That's what's most frightening to me, is that we don't know what is happening in Afghanistan today, but we do know that historically Al-Qaeda has committed to it's said that it's a very patient organization. I go back to Congressman Katko in his opening statement. He talked about Ramzi bin al-Shibh, and after the first attack on the World Trade Center, he was helicoptered past the World Trade Center, and if FBI agent, the story goes, the FBI agent said to him, "Look, those towers are still standing," and he said, "Yeah, but we'll try again. They'll be coming down." And that happened, 7-8 years later. Al-Qaeda members don't retire. The Islamic State, they fight and wage jihad until they're either killed or they're infirm. This is it. We know they're not going to stop plotting against us. What I believe has happened now is, in the short term, they're operating in Afghanistan and Pakistan. The Taliban is consolidating its gains. Al-Qaeda is helping the Taliban with that. Al-Qaeda is patient. It doesn't need to attack us today, tomorrow, or next week, or even next year to be that threat. That's what we learned. That was the lesson of 9/11. They tried to take down the World Trade Centers 8 years before it actually happened. This is a patient organization, and our lack of visibility into the situation inside of Afghanistan is a direct threat to the U.S. homeland.
Well, I'm looking at this briefing, and it says just a few weeks ago, CNN reported that 5 detainees who had been held at Guantanamo for more than a decade have been cleared for release. And with these, 18 out of the currently 39 detainees have been cleared for transfer and are eligible for release pending diplomatic arrangements. And the diplomatic process is underway to work or transfer or repatriate them as appropriate, said John Kirby, the DoD spokesman. So where's the accountability? How do we track those individuals that will now be sent or repatriated? What should we be looking for?
There's never have been accountability on this issue. At one point in time, the Department of Defense put the recidivism rate of Guantanamo detainee released back into the wild. It's somewhere around 30 to 40%. And again, that's an optimistic assessment that you're going to get from the Department of Defense. The number is much likely very higher. Former Gitmo detainees who were released, members of the Taliban, immediately joined the group. They became part of the negotiating team. Historically, the recidivism rate among Guantanamo Bay detainees is quite high. Unless they're arrested into the countries that they're released to, which very often does not happen, they will return to wage jihad at some point or another. Again, this is a part of the lack of visibility on this. Many of these detainees are released, and we don't know what's happening. I had personal experience with one Guantanamo detainee when I was embedded with the U.S. military as a reporter in Iraq. Guantanamo detainee who we released to Kuwait became a suicide bomber at a base that I was at just 2 days prior, and I was on scene there. It was one of the largest suicide attacks in Iraq in its history. It left a massive crater. It looked like the Kansas City bombings. That's what happens to these Gitmo detainees. In one way or another, they wind up rejoining the fight.
Yeah, they never retire.
Young lady's time has expired. Chair recognizes gentlelady from New Jersey, Ms. Watson Coleman, for 5 minutes.
Hi, can you hear me, Chairman? Thank you. First of all, I want to thank you for this hearing. It has been very illuminating. I want to thank all the witnesses. Mr. Roggio, I do want to agree with you about how we mishandled the Afghanistan move, but I want us to get beyond that in this discussion today, because I think primarily we're concerned about this convergence of extremism that seems to target people, the same kind of people, the same anti-authority issues, even if they don't share the same ideology. And it's very concerning to someone like me, a Black woman in America. I see it from the school boards now. Whoever thought you'd see that kind of just abuse and potential violence at school boards all the way up to the Capitol and beyond. I'm very concerned that since January the 5th to today, which is the second day of celebrating Black History Month, that there have been bomb threats at 15 HBCUs, that I have no HBCU in my district or in the state of New Jersey, but I have a lot of students that go there, because the majority of our Black students that get educated, from doctors, lawyers to undergrad, go to HBCUs. Clearly, I'm disappointed that I'm not seeing enough coverage of it, that it doesn't seem to take on the kind of media interest that other situations have, and that's very disappointing. But Dr. Miller, I'm certain that you all find this very alarming, and Mr. Rasmussen, I'm sure that you all find this very alarming, and that you are paying attention to what's happening on the various platforms of sharing information. So I'd like to know to what extent we know anything about sort of any coordination, any similarities in who's involved, and are we significantly recognizing this as a terrorist threat? It is, the way we recognize, rightfully so, anti-Semitic terrorist threats against Asians, terrorist threats against Muslims, terrorist threats against African Americans. And it is particularly disturbing and disgusting that it's happening at the same month that we stand apart and take note of all of the contributions of African Americans in making this country the great country it is. So I'd love for you to respond, Dr. Miller, and you, Mr. Rasmussen.
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. It is especially abhorrent to see these bomb threats coming in during Black History Month. And I would say that although right now we don't know, and our definition of terrorism in the country relies on intent, and we don't know the intent because the accountability issue and investigations are still ongoing, but we know the impact is to terrorize people. We know that the impact is to terrorize students and communities across the country, much like the Jewish community is terrorized every time that there's an attack, and any Asian American or any minority community is terrorized by ongoing attacks. And so I think we have to focus not just on these accountability and investigations and that part of it, but look at what are we doing to invest to prevent more of this rising, what appears to be coordinated. At least those phone calls came in within minutes of each other, either from the same person or from some sort of coordinated attack. As we find out more about the investigations, we'll know more about the motive, but I think it's really important to understand the impact and how horrifying that is and how disruptive that is to the equitable learning experiences of any young person at a Black college or university.
Thank you. Mr. Rasmussen, I know that you all monitor sort of internet platforms and internet companies and what's happening there. What are you seeing as it relates to these threats against the HBCUs and the threats against just sort of the Black communities wherever you find them in general? Are you all tracking anything as it relates to them?
So I'll speak both generally and specifically, ma'am, because I think broadly speaking, this unfortunate set of threats this week to the HBCUs fits a pattern we've long seen, and that's just a steady expansion of the amount of racially and ethnically motivated violent extremist language and engagement in the online world. And that's why we're here in many ways today. With respect to this specific case, Dr. Miller-Idris pointed out exactly what I would have, which is we're early days in the investigation. I will be very curious to see what law enforcement turns up by way of connections between the individuals making these calls. Was there prior online engagement? Were they gathering in communities of fellow travelers, sharing these ideological leanings on the internet? We'll learn more in the weeks ahead, but unfortunately, I think it fits a pattern we've seen for quite a while now, growing in both size and scale.
So thank you. Mr. Greenblatt, I know you.
Young lady's time has expired.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. For those on the call, in a briefing with the FBI yesterday, they indicated that these threats that are being made to historically Black colleges has risen to the top of their list in terms of priority. And they will give it whatever resource needed to come to some definition and ultimate capture of individuals who have started that. So we look forward to hearing from them.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, because my concern was going to be questioning about do we need additional resources and what they might be. I thank you and I yield back.
I recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Jimenez, for 5 minutes. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Clyde, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My gentleman colleague from California, just a couple of members ago, seems to think that Donald Trump was president last summer during the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. Personally, I would have preferred if Donald Trump were the president last summer. If that had been the case, we would not have had the disastrous withdrawal that we saw. But it was Joe Biden who is the president, and Joe Biden who is completely and totally responsible for the crisis on the world stage known as the Afghanistan disaster. President Biden showed weakness then, and he continues to show weakness. And we all know that weakness promotes aggression. Unlike Ronald Reagan's policy of peace through strength, Joe Biden's weakness on the world stage has promoted the current Ukraine crisis and the real possibility that we may very soon see another war in Europe. Crisis after crisis is the legacy of our current president, Joe Biden. Mr. Rogio, the world watched in horror as the Taliban's ragtag bunch of undisciplined fighters forced the American military into a self-made and self-chosen corner at Kabul airport last summer. Considering the optic of that disastrous withdrawal, what impact do you believe it had on foreign terrorist organizations?
Thank you, sir. The foreign terrorist organizations were buoyed by what happened after the Taliban took control of the country. The U.S. was boxed into a corner in Kabul. The images of that withdrawal, the videos of this withdrawal were distributed widely by jihadist organizations, not by individuals, jihadist sympathizers, members of the Taliban, suspected jihadists on social media platforms. I saw these myself. They were crowing over the fact that the U.S., which that they've beaten a superpower, and we can't deny this. What happened in Afghanistan was a defeat for the United States. We wasted 20 years of blood and treasure, whatever number you want to put to that, whether it's $1 trillion, $2 trillion. I've seen all kinds of crazy estimates, but the reality is we spent 20 years trying to stand up an Afghan government, and we failed. And we failed because we left precipitously. We never gave the Afghan government an opportunity to defend itself. The decision was we're leaving, and we're leaving in a short amount of time. It took 2 months to execute, or 2.5 months from the day that President Biden announced the withdrawal. We left a small force behind. So after the U.S. left by July 4th, within a month and a half, the Taliban were in control of Afghanistan, and we were forced to leave. The propaganda boon for Al Qaeda, for the Taliban, and other jihadist groups that has come out of Afghanistan. Afghans clinging to the wheels of planes and falling from the sky, the airport being overrun, U.S. soldiers holding weapons pointing at Afghans. This is recruiting material that they're going to use both, internationally to wage their local jihads, as well as to sponsor attacks against the U.S. homeland.
Thank you. I think we will see this time and time again over your lifetime and my lifetime both. And thank you for confirming that indeed it was President Biden who announced the withdrawal from Afghanistan. It was not President Trump who was president at the time. He did not have the executive authority. He was not the commander-in-chief. It was President Joe Biden who was the commander-in-chief, who gave the military the order. And as a military officer myself, I fully understand how the military operates. And it was Joe Biden's order. It was his directive that the military fulfilled. Therefore, the responsibility falls 100% at the feet of President Joe Biden. It was a disaster then. It's a disaster now. It will continue to be a disaster for years and years and years to come because of how it will be exploited by terrorist organizations, and they will buoy their ranks with it, and it will be a detriment to the United States. And with that, thank you, and I yield back.
Yields back. Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities toward the president. We do have decorum, and I encourage you to do so. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Nevada, Ms. Titus, for 5 minutes. Gentlelady from Nevada.
Excuse me, I thought I clicked it. Before I ask my question about something related to my district, Las Vegas, I would just point out that the deadline date for withdrawing was set by President Trump, that Pompeo met with the Taliban, and when all of this was negotiated, it was negotiated with the Taliban by the Trump administration, and the Afghan government was not even at the table. So let's be sure we get all our facts out there if we're going to talk about what happened with the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Now, my question that's related to Las Vegas has to do with the fact that just about any time we see a terrorist attack, there's some connection to my district. That was true in Oklahoma City. Some of the terrorists had been through Nevada. Same was true in 9/11. Now, the latest was the mass shooting on October the 1st, 2017, at a music concert when the largest number of people were killed in that one incident. Now, following that, we had a large volume of hoaxes, conspiracy theories, and misinformation that popped up all over the internet about the identity of the gunman, what was his religious affiliation. Some people even call this horrific event a false flag, and we've seen the same thing happen in countless other tragedies of gun violence. So I've asked all the panelists, how do you separate gun violence from terrorism, and how do you respond to all the misinformation that comes out that is used to radicalize people and recruit people in the wake of some of these gun violent attacks?
Maybe I'll jump in there first, ma'am. I think the distinguishing feature that we would look for in defining something as terrorism versus gun violence or criminal gun violence is the ideological motivation, or the set of ideas, beliefs, or views that are driving the person to take action. And as you know better than anybody from the case in Las Vegas, that was the huge conundrum there for federal law enforcement. They were never able to put their hands around a specific set of reasons why that horrific act took place. So when thinking about it, you can't really, in our world, call that a terrorist attack in the same way that you might when you're talking about someone who's motivated by a particularly hateful ideology. But I'm sure Dr. Miller-Idris has a lot to say on the definitional piece of this as well. This is her life's work in many ways.
Thank you. Even if it's not a terrorist attack, though, it often motivates people the way a terrorist attack would.
And it can still inspire terror, no question.
Right.
That's particularly true for accelerationists who sometimes have taken advantage of those types of mass shooting attacks to try to prompt additional violence, because violence is part of their ultimate goal and not just a means to an end. I would just say that, I think one of the reasons why DHS and others have sometimes used the words terrorism and targeted violence is because of exactly of this slippery problem, but also because our definitions evolve over time too. So we have come to recognize violent incel, involuntary celibate, terror as a form of domestic extremism and terrorist violence in some cases, but for many years that those attacks, like on a sorority in California and a yoga studio in Florida and elsewhere, we have seen those as personality problems of the individual actors, until there was a recognition that a male supremacist misogyny was at root of a targeted hateful violent act against a group of people. So this is also part of the problem, is that these things, it's not just the salad bar and the blurring of the ideologies, but sometimes our own understanding has to catch up with the efforts as they happen on the part of violent actors.
Congresswoman, I'll just jump in and say that firearms are far and away the weapon of choice for violent extremists in this country. Regardless of your personal views on firearm ownership or the Second Amendment, there is simply no doubt, based on the data, that there are some common sense measures that could be taken to make it much harder for those who seek to harm our communities with hateful extremist backgrounds to have easy access to lethal weapons. I mean, first and foremost, we need to close the loophole that allows guns to be sold without a criminal background check. That doesn't make sense to me. The perpetrator in Colleyville never should have been able to buy a gun as a foreign visitor to this country. Yet he was easily able to purchase a handgun used in the attack 2 days prior on a street corner with no paperwork, no questions asked. Adding insult to injury, the man who sold this gun to Akram, who's, and again, this Al-Qaeda sympathizer, was himself prohibited from gun ownership because of his own criminal history. So he shouldn't have had one. I mean, all of this is absurd. Requiring a criminal background check prior to every gun sale, it's just common sense. I would think there would be bipartisan interest in that to make it harder for domestic terrorists, again, across the spectrum, to get their hands on these weapons. And I must say, Congresswoman, like we've seen Boogaloo Boys, we had an incident in Las Vegas, I think it's in 2020, where three people, again, back to the other question, right? Three members of the of the U.S. military were arrested because they were planning a plot and they were affiliated with the Boogaloo Boys. And I think last weekend we had an incident by the Goyim Defense League with anti-Semitic flying in Las Vegas and a bunch of other cities across the country. So we have extremism right there in Nevada, right there in Las Vegas, like you said, and some simple, easy, bipartisan measures like requiring the criminal background check would make all of our communities safer.
Lady's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Pfluger, for 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Simple, easy, bipartisan measures. I couldn't agree more. On the committee that was formed in the wake of 9/11, I've spent my entire career in a post 9/11 military, fighting in so many different places. And Mr. Greenblatt, do you know how many people voted for an amendment on this committee? My colleagues across the aisle, not a single person voted on amendment to figure out the country of origin, the terror affiliation, and any sort of derogatory information in the Darwa detention facility, Policharki prison in the Afghanistan withdrawal. Not a single person. So these are, what are we doing on a committee for Homeland Security if we're not figuring out where the terror threat is? So, Mr. Raggio, as a FDD fellow myself, I'll start with you. Are you worried about those 5,000 plus people that were released, or did they just kind of disappear back into their normal lives and have no terror ambitions at all from this point on?
Oh, I'm extremely worried. One of the things I keep detecting when I'm from this committee is that, well, Afghanistan's Afghanistan, and it's not a threat to the U.S. homeland. But we had the largest terrorist attack occur on U.S. soil because Afghanistan was a safe haven for terrorists. However many have been killed in domestic terror attacks, it's dwarfed by the 3,000 that have been killed by Al-Qaeda on 9/11 and subsequent attacks by Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. Yes, I'm absolutely worried about those 5,000 prisoners who were released. We don't know where they are. Some of them were Islamic State, and I'm told, again, I can't confirm this, but I have no doubt, because of information we know about the Haqqani network and the Islamic State, that some members of the Islamic State were absorbed by the Taliban. Some members of Al-Qaeda have gone back to their jobs. And some members of the Islamic State rejoined the Islamic State, and that's the element that opposes the Taliban government. None of that is good for security here on the U.S. homeland. We have armies of terrorists, not just in Afghanistan, but in Somalia, in Mali, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in Syria, in Pakistan. I'm talking tens of thousands of fighters, often in each place, that can be recruited and pointed at the United States to conduct attacks against the U.S. homeland. This is one of their goals, is to hit us here, to make the price for fighting them overseas too costly. So we should be concerned about every single individual who left. Do we even know the names of all of them? I hope the U.S. government, the U.S. military and intelligence services was able to obtain that information of these individuals. With the Taliban controlling passports, these people can leave the country and enter other countries and possibly have access to the United States. All of these things should be deeply worrying to every member of this committee. These are groups, terror organizations that are committed to hurting us here in the United States and to targeting U.S. interests overseas as well.
So what I'm hearing is that they haven't taken their eye off their mission, which is their desire to attack Americans. We saw it with the 13 service members that were killed in the tragic, yet very predictable way that we had in the botched withdrawal. And I just think that, you know, we're kidding ourselves. And I do think that these are easy bipartisan issues. And for the life of me, I can't understand why there would be any sort of disagreement on these. Luckily, that amendment actually passed in the NDAA, but not a single person on this committee on the other side of the aisle voted for that amendment on this committee when presented. Mr. Greenblatt, let me turn to you, and thanks, Mr. Raggio, for your answer there. And I couldn't agree more. I mean, we have to focus on terrorism, and any sort of extremism is wrong. Any extremism is wrong, and let's look at it for what it is. But Mr. Greenblatt, you know, I live in Texas. My district is not a border district per se geographically. Is it safe to say, and do you agree that there are people who want to enter this country by all means? We saw the Colleyville attacker that entered with a passport, and we need to get to the bottom of that. But what do you say about known or suspected terrorists entering our country? Do they have a desire to enter our country, and should we be worried about the southern border?
Congressman Fluger, first thing I want to do is thank you for your service. I know you're a military veteran.
Thank you.
I served in the Air Force. Secondly, I could not agree more with the fear of foreign terrorists trying to get into America. If I might, just for a moment, I can't say the specifics about attempted entries from the southern border because I'm not familiar with that, but we are very worried about the Islamic Republic of Iran, the largest state sponsor in the world, which continues to try to put people inside the United States. There was an FBI case last year where they identified an Iranian dissident, Masih Ahmadinejad, who is being targeted for kidnapping and rendition to Tehran by the Islamic Republic. Mr. Congressman, I would implore you to look at the danger of Iran and their efforts to, they have surveilled Jewish institutions like synagogues, Chabad houses, JCCs. Their people have been arrested in Chicago, in New York, in Los Angeles. I am deeply worried about that and would be delighted to work with you to explore this issue because it's a threat to all of us.
So we should be worried about any method of entry, and the 2 million people that have entered illegally. You know, there's a chance that 1 or 2 of those might have terror ties. There's a chance that 1 or 2 of those might have popped on a known or suspected terror watch list. You know, our eye is so far off the ball. We've not had a single hearing yet on border security. And so I'm kind of wondering about that. So last question, Mr. Greenblatt, do you believe that the Houthis should be on the foreign terrorist organization designated, should they be a designated terror organization?
The Houthis absolutely should be a foreign designated terror organization. They have They would attempt, look, we know they're bombing, trying to fire allies on our missiles in Abu Dhabi. We know they are agitating and militating against our ally Israel. We know their anti-American propaganda is extensive. They're a proxy state like Hezbollah and Syria of the Iranian regime. They absolutely should be on the list. No questions asked.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Rice, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all the witnesses for coming here today to talk about this very important issue. And a lot of what I've been hearing from the witnesses is, steps that you think that we can take here as members of Congress to address the issues of which we speak. Last June, the Biden administration released the first ever national strategy for countering domestic terrorism, which was a comprehensive framework for how the federal government can understand and respond to domestic terror threats and attempt to cut them down at their roots. Mr. Rasmussen, Mr. Greenblatt, it's been more than 6 months since they announced this framework. What did they get? What did the White House get right in this strategy? What did they not get right? What do we need to focus on to supplement what I think everyone would agree was a long overdue national strategy? So if I could start with you, Mr. Rasmussen, and then go to Mr. Greenblatt.
Sure. And thank you, Congresswoman Rice. I read that document very closely when it came out and took note of several features. One, I think, was a clear recognition of the need to kind of be, in a sense, threat agnostic, that the domestic terrorism threat looks a lot of different ways. It crosses the ideological spectrum. Though, as Dr. Miller Idris points out, the data suggests that there's far more to be worried about in terms of volume on the far extreme right than in other parts of the ideological spectrum. I think the strategy also did well to make clear that this needs to be a lot of work done outside of government with government to get a better handle on this. And that includes, of course, cooperation with industry, the technology sector, the group of colleagues I work with in that sector, and that we aren't going to necessarily make progress on this if we simply look to government programming alone. And then the last piece I would point to is the call for greater investment in the prevention architecture. And a lot of that work, of course, is done at the Department of Homeland Security, working with communities around the country. And I think there's a clear signal that the administration wants to lean into that set of programs. And I think that's encouraging.
Mr. Greenblatt, can you unmute?
Madam Congressman, nice to see you. Thank you for the question. I used to work in the West Wing, right? And I used to develop strategies like this. So I have some particular views on it. I do think it was a landmark. We've never seen a White House strategy on countering domestic terrorism. So they rightly deserve credit for that. And I give them credit because they had a whole of government approach. That really matters. And it draws a lot from ADL's Protect plan, which I mentioned before. And it acknowledged systemic racism and these structural issues, which are, again, part of the problem. But there were things that it missed. So number one, it was a strategy. It's not an implementation plan. You should ask the White House. You should ask, the folks there. You should ask the OMB. So where are the budgets and what are the implementation plans for every agency to act on this? That should be number one, right? Number two, I think it missed the big tech piece. So again, as I said before, social media is an information superhighway for domestic extremists, for foreign agents from places like the Islamic Republic of Iran and others. Big tech needs to be accountable on this, engaged and accountable. So my friend Nick, I really appreciate what he's doing, Congresswoman, at GCFT, and yet the companies need to do far more on their own platforms. And then number three, I think ultimately we need a whole of society strategy. We need not just social media, but the whole business community involved, and we need civil society involved. So I'd want to see a 3-part process going forward so that we're all working together, because this threat threatens all of us. Congressman, we all need to be engaged in it together.
Mr. Greenblatt, just along that note, I think, you can have a strategy, but if you don't understand the trends and how they are overlapping, intersecting, can you just expound a little bit in the short time that we have left on the trends, pointing to you point out the growing connections between anti-Semitism and other violent extremist ideologies. Can you just talk a little bit more about that trend?
Well, there's no question that anti-Semitism is at the beating heart of white supremacy. So from Charlottesville to Capitol Hill, it's not an accident that these men were wearing T-shirts that said 6MWE or yelling Jews will not replace us. And anti-Semitism is at the beating heart of radical Islamism. It's not an accident that the guy in Colliesville was trying to get an Al-Qaeda operative who was arrested, Congresswoman, because she tried to kill American soldiers, because she had information or possession that suggested she was surveilling American sites. She wanted to kill Americans. And yet at her trial, she said that the jurists, or the potential jurists, should be DNA tested to see if they were Zionists. I mean, it's lunatic. So radical Islamism, violent white supremacy, they have this hatred of the Jews at their core. And even other groups that we may think are less frightening, like QAnon, espouse lunatic theories about Jewish space lasers or other stuff. So look, in this moment, and I know you represent Long Island, we've seen anti-Semitic flyering and harassment right in your district, in the broader New York area as well. And when Jews are being attacked in broad daylight on our streets, that should be a problem for all of us.
Agreed. Thank you. Thank you.
Young lady's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Letourneau, for 5 minutes. Chair recognizes the young lady from Florida, Ms. Dimmons, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the ranking member and to all of our witnesses here today who are engaging in this very important discussion. This past weekend, the day after we recognized International Holocaust Remembrance Day, neo-Nazis held rallies in Central Florida. I represent Florida. They shouted anti-Semitic slurs, waved Nazi flags, and chanted, "The Jew is the devil." I have to say, as a career law enforcement officer, I am disappointed that Homeland Security has become such a political, partisan issue, because I think that we can all do better. Now, make no mistake, as a former law enforcement officer, I am not unfamiliar with hate organizations. I have been in their presence on numerous occasions. But let me be clear, of all of the protections that our Constitution guarantees us in this great nation, violence is not one of those protections. The group that broke the peace this weekend is not merely a half dozen malcontents, as some have categorized them. Group leader was indicted in Arizona just days before for pointing a gun at a group of Black men outside a hotel. Mr. Greenblatt, you have already talked about how important it is to really speak up and speak out against this type of behavior. So I'd really like to direct my question to the other witnesses. If you could also tell us how important it is for community leaders, faith-based elected officials to identify and condemn, have zero tolerance for these type of threats, whether it's anti-Semitic, racist, white nationalists, or otherwise. And Ms. Idris, we'll start with you.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, Ms. Demings. I think it's essential, as we've heard those words from Jonathan Greenblatt so clearly. One of the things we saw in Texas was the incredible solidarity from the interfaith community, a Catholic priest and an imam and a minister, evangelical minister, sitting across the street in command center throughout the hostage crisis, and really condemning that actively. And we've seen some media coverage of that. It's so important to see those interfaith expressions condemning Islamophobia, condemning anti-Semitism, to have anyone from across the political spectrum condemn hate and violence when we see it, to raise the voices against what's happening in HBCUs, and to really be clear, what are the values that we all stand for as a community across political lines, across our differences, because we have to start setting some of those norms and values in order for us to begin to heal and move forward.
Thank you so much. I'm going to move on for sake of time. Mr. Greenblatt, the nation was horrified last month, as we have already talked about, with an armed gunman held congregants hostage at a Texas synagogue. As someone who has been a lifelong supporter of nonprofit security grants, I was heartened that the rabbi was able to put the security practices he learned through training funded by those grants into action to resolve this situation, or at least without loss of life. How should Congress be looking at the program given the dynamic threat landscape?
So Congresswoman Demings, first and foremost, thank you for the question. Thank you for your leadership in law enforcement for so many years. You know, ADL partners with law enforcement in Orlando, in Florida, around the country. We couldn't do our work to fight hate without that cooperation. So I'm grateful for that. To your question, and I would also say we watched this rally by these Nazis in your area over the weekend. It was disgusting. And to anyone who is confused about the threat of right-wing extremism, listen to what the Congresswoman said. Literally, please just listen. Google what happened. It is shocking and stunning that anyone would simply dismiss these people as jackasses. They're not jackasses. They are sinister, violent extremists with a lethal agenda. I'm sorry, I just had to get that out because I don't think it's political to call out prejudice, and I don't think it's nuanced to say we should get rid of the Nazis. That being said, as it relates specifically to what should Congress do, double the funding for the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, the DHS dollars that help provide security and training for religious institutions. By the way, not just synagogues, but mosques, black churches, you know, Hindu temples, Sikh gurdwaras, etc. Last year, there were $400 million in applications alone, and yet we only have a $180 million program. I think the government should fund at least 90% of that. So if you could bring it from 180 to $360 million, as we like to say, Dayenu.
To all of our witnesses, thank you so much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Barragon. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York for 5 minutes, Mr. Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. More and more conspiracy theories are circulating than ever before, caused by threats, foreign and domestic, foreign threats like Russian influence operations, and domestic threats like social media algorithms that amplify disinformation. Those conspiracy theories are spreading faster and faster than ever before and escalating into more violence than ever before. History tells us that a conspiracy theory can be a gateway drug to anti-Semitism because anti-Semitism is itself a conspiracy theory of its own. So my first question is to Mr. Greenblatt. Do you worry, as I do, that the increasingly conspiratorial politics of America has become a breeding ground for violent anti-Semitism?
Mr. Congressman, thank you for the question. And I just want to thank you for your principled leadership on these issues, which I know all of us in the Jewish community so respect. Yeah, I would suggest that conspiratorial minds, whether you demonize the Jewish people or the Jewish state, it leads to violence. We saw that happen last May, Mr. Congressman, when wild, unhinged claims about the state of Israel led to Jews being beaten up in broad daylight in Midtown Manhattan, in Los Angeles, all over the United States. And so again, when you have conspiracies in your head about Jewish power or Jewish influence, it often leads to real world violence. And all of us should unequivocally and singularly call that out, right? Not qualify it with, well, there's complex issues in the Middle East. I'm sorry. You might not like what happens in China, but that's no excuse to beat up Asian Americans. You might not like what happens in Mexico. That's no excuse to beat up Latinos. And you might not like what happens in the Middle East. That's no excuse to attack Jews, full stop.
And as you pointed out during the conflict in May of 2021, if I remember correctly, the hashtag Hitler was right was retweeted 18,000 times. Is that correct?
More than that, scores of thousands of times, which gets us back to why if big tech just did their job, they could have helped to mitigate this right away.
You know, your organization has reported that since 2019, anti-Semitic incidents have risen to levels not seen in 4 decades. The Tree of Life synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh and the Congregation Beth Israel hostage crisis in Colleyville. These events did not happen in a vacuum. These events are part of a larger wave of violent anti-Semitism that has taken hold in America. There was a journalist who wrote the following, which I found striking. She said, quote, 10 years ago, my synagogue and my kids' Jewish school had no armed guards. Now both have a near platoon of special forces guys. In the last 5 years, my kids' Jewish camp and my kosher grocery have hired armed guards because of threats. This is how Jews live now. Americans should know. Mr. Greenblatt, do these words reflect what you're observing on the ground?
These words exactly reflect what I'm seeing on the ground, Mr. Congressman. Like, Jews are concerned that shopping in a kosher supermarket puts them in harm's way. They are concerned that showing up for a Shabbat service is putting your life at risk. They are concerned that, like in Brooklyn, walking with your children in a stroller, they might be spit at by someone who tells them they should have burned in Auschwitz. I mean, it is astonishing to see the level of animus that is out there. And again, so we need public, whether it's extremism from the right or illiberalism from the left, or again, anti-Semitism from Islamist radicals or whomever. I don't know, we can't afford any politicians to politicize this or to weaponize it. That's why I appreciate how you've spoken out again and again, Mr. Congressman, and I wish others would do the same.
And I want to know for the record that I strongly support a doubling of funding for the nonprofit security grant program. It's a vital tool protecting vulnerable communities from violent extremism, which includes protecting the Jewish community from violent anti-Semitism. My final question is for Mr. Rasmussen. If Russia invades Ukraine and if the US severely sanctions Russia in response, do you worry, as I do, that a Russian invasion of Ukraine could trigger a sequence of events that could raise the risk of cyber terrorism from Russia or from Russian state-sponsored cyber actors? Is that a reasonable fear?
Well, Mr. Torres, it's certainly a reasonable fear that if Russia is able to use these tools in the context of a aggression against Ukraine, it allows them to refine these tools and potentially learn what works and doesn't work, and they can store that knowledge away for future conflict, including conflict that might involve the United States. We already, of course, know the Russians are sophisticated actors in this space, and the Ukraine theater right now simply allows them to, in a sense, hone their tradecraft and hone their tactics in ways that it will certainly add to their capability over time in ways that we're not going to find very comforting.
My time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. I look forward to working with the Vice Chair on increasing the amount of the nonprofit grant program from where it is now at $180 million. Chair recognizes gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Letourneau, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Rasmussen, terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS have historically harnessed modern technology to recruit and invigorate their members, as you know well. Did GIFCT or its partners notice any changes in online activity from terrorists and extremist groups either during the withdrawal from Afghanistan or in the months since?
You're absolutely right, sir, that established terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS have long used the online domain as a way to generate recruits, spread their message, engage in even operational planning and training. In response to the Afghanistan events, what we have seen is that the narrative generated out of that is, of course, being turned to advantage by terrorist groups. They're using this as, in a sense, their proof that they have defeated a superpower, that they have expelled the United States from South Asia, that they have, in a sense, won. And that narrative, of course, serves as a powerful recruiting tool for new adherence to their cause. Now, it's hard to kind of draw a linear connection between using that narrative online and actually how does that manifest itself in real terrorist capability. But there's no question that the narrative serves their purpose.
Have you noticed, you talk about the narrative, and I obviously you're correct about the narrative being helpful, but do you have any way to quantify how helpful it's been in an uptick over the last several months?
I don't know that we do. It's maybe something I can consult with our research network to try to find a little more precision to put around that, because what I'm offering is, I know, a bit more impressionistic and perhaps not as data driven as might be useful. So let me take that one and come back to you, sir.
I would appreciate that information. Thank you. And a follow-up for Mr. Roggio. Could you please tell the committee about how foreign terrorist organizations traditionally recruit more members? How is their process likely implicated as a result of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan?
Sure. Yes. Thank you, sir. The traditional recruitment, it occurs obviously online. That's a big place. That's where they try to reach, particularly try to reach Westerners, to get people in their home countries to attempt to conduct attacks or join the organization. But a lot of the recruiting is done locally in individual countries where they have a presence. So in Yemen, they'll recruit from their tribes or families in Yemen, and same thing, Somalia. And this is why, again, I keep going back to the issue of safe haven. When these groups are able to operate in the open, they're able to more easily recruit, train, and indoctrinate local fighters. Not all of them are going to be used to launch attacks against the West, but as we saw with 9/11, only a small fraction of, it's estimated that tens of thousands of Al-Qaeda fighters went through camps prior to 9/11 and were trained through Al-Qaeda camps in Afghanistan. They selected, I believe it was 17 of them were from Afghanistan camps. It may have been all 19. That's all they needed to execute 9/11. This is so. Again, I know I keep going back to the issue of safe haven, but that is the lifeblood for jihadist groups to organize, train, and project their power, and in order to conduct attacks against U.S. homeland or U.S. Citizens, businesses, military installations overseas.
I appreciate that response and agree with it. Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
Yields back. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Paragon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start by thanking you, Mr. Chairman, and Representative Bonnie Watson-Coleman for bringing up the issue of the bomb threats against historically Black colleges and universities and other minority-serving institutions to this committee. These threats are disturbing. They should outrage us all. And I believe we must talk about them in the context of domestic extremism and the potential for domestic terrorism. I know that several HBCUs in your district, Mr. Chairman, were impacted, as well as a school in my district, Charles R. Drew University, which is a historically Black graduate institute and minority serving institution, where the majority of medical and healthcare students are Black and Latino, have received a bomb threat as well. They have been having to clear campuses up late at night, and this is just something that shouldn't be happening. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for immediately raising the seriousness of this threat with the FBI and DHS, and know that I'm here to work alongside you on this issue to address these acts on intimidation and domestic terrorism rooted in racism and bigotry. I now want to turn my questions to the issue of misinformation for all the witnesses. If you could, given the short time, maybe respond with a yes or no. Does misinformation and disinformation play a role in the active or passive recruitment of people into extremist groups or subcultures? Anybody want to start?
I would say yes, it does, ma'am.
Absolutely, yes.
Yes, it does.
Okay, I don't think I hear anybody disagreeing. Have you seen the use of misinformation and disinformation increase over the last several years? Would anybody say that has not?
Absolutely.
It has, for sure.
There's no
Right.
question that social media has just continues to increase and expand.
And is there any evidence that any increase or in the misuse the misinformation or disinformation fueled by online platforms, social media, and traditional media has led to an increase in domestic extremism and the potential for domestic terrorism.
That
Yes.
is also very clear. Yes.
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 I think this is just to highlight the misinformation and what's happening and the role these online platforms have, I think, in addressing this. The Congressional Hispanic Caucus is going to be holding a hearing in conjunction with House Admin in Miami upcoming on Monday to address the issue of misinformation and what's happening. And so it's something that we'll continue to work on. And I just wanted to kind of highlight that issue. To moving on to another topic, this is also to all the witnesses. In 2020 and early 2021, we saw violence at some state capitals stemming from protests focused on COVID-19 related restrictions. In the second half of 2021, school boards and city council meetings have been the site of violence and chaos related to COVID-19 restrictions and other local measures. Can you describe why this violence has become so localized, and is it widespread as it seems?
I'll answer first, and then just welcome comments from the other panelists. But I actually highlighted this, ma'am, in my written testimony, the longer version, the way in which during this COVID period, we've actually seen groups or individuals with radically different ideological takes on the world are uniting around issues related to COVID or grabbing on to pieces of the COVID story that we've all experienced over the last 2 years and using it to fuel their own progression towards extremism. So it's made for some very strange bedfellows in that online environment who would otherwise have very little in common, but for their grabbing on to a particular narrative about COVID, whether it's government overreach or vaccination, conspiracy theories, et cetera. So it's an interesting phenomenon and one we're still trying very hard to understand.
Thank you. Mr. Greenblatt?
Look, from the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, disinformation about the virus circulated widely on social media. We had elected officials, mainstream media outlets promoting lies, including the theory that the vaccine was an effort by the government to control the population. And as a result of that, you had conspiracy theorists, extremists, members of the public targeting physicians, nurses, hospital workers, public health officials and scientists, harassing them, threatening them, assaulting them. And in 2021, we had public schools and school board meetings where you saw extraordinary vitriol, forgotten ways we've never seen before around masking mandates and vaccines, conspiracy around CRT. And again, you can have strong feelings about what your kids learn, but the idea that there's some plot to take over the system I don't agree with. We don't have the data at ADL that bears that out. And I think it is the disinformation being like fed intravenously, Congresswoman, to communities today because of the 24/7 nature of social media that's warped the way they think and turned these like localized extremism and turned again these like the local political process into a battleground.
Well, thank you. I apologize to the rest of the witnesses as I'm out of time. But I also want to join with you, Mr. Greenblatt, in standing with you on anti-Semitism and what's happening to our American Jewish community. And so I will work closely with the committee on that issue as well. Thank you. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Young lady yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Malinowski, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I didn't know we'd be talking about Afghanistan today, but since we are, I just wanted to ask Mr. Roggio a couple of questions. Obviously, the release of those prisoners in early September by the Taliban was a very bad thing for all the reasons that have been stated. But I just want to make sure that we're clear that the United States did not ask for those prisoners to be released or order those prisoners to be released. That was done arguably as a consequence of our withdrawal, but it was not something that we intended to happen. Is that a fair statement?
That is correct. The release of the prisoners happened because the Taliban overran those prisons.
Right. Has the United States government ever asked or ordered authorities in Afghanistan to release large numbers of militants to the battlefield?
That is correct. The Trump administration, as part of its deal with the Taliban, requested that the Afghan government release 5,000 prisoners in exchange for 1,000. I want to be perfectly clear that the decision to negotiate with the Taliban and to cut that deal with the Taliban, to withdraw, is what was I disagreed with that, and I disagreed with the method of the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan. Both was disastrous policy.
Good. We agree then. I just want to make sure we're fair that this was over 2 administrations.
That's correct.
Back to the domestic threat. I think, it's striking from the testimony of all of our witnesses that we are facing a very decentralized threat. I think it's a fair assessment of your testimony. The idea that most violent extremists are card-carrying members of a specific organization, that they take orders from a particular boss, that they have training camps, all these sort of old images that we associate with terrorist groups, is not really the reality in the United States today. Is that a fair statement? I put that maybe to you, Mr. Rasmussen.
Exactly right, Mr. Malinowski, and the features you've described are what makes navigating that environment more challenging, not only for law enforcement and intelligence services operating in that environment, but for companies trying to figure out, okay, how do we manage the online environment when you don't have group affiliation?
Well, so back to I was heading towards the online environment problem. It seems to me that right now that the organizational structure of terrorism is a Facebook group. The training camp is a YouTube channel. And I wanted to turn to you, Mr. Greenblatt. You covered a lot of this in your testimony. I wanted to ask you to talk to us a bit about the role that social media companies' recommendation algorithms play in drawing people to these groups, to these ideas.
Mr. Congressman, there's no doubt. These technology platforms are wired to optimize for user engagement, and they frequently amplify, hate and bias-motivated violence as a strategy to generate revenue. I'm not saying there are people doing it behind the scenes, but the algorithms are engineered to amplify and increase virality. And as I said before, if it bleeds, it leads. The tech community should not have blanket immunity from liability when their algorithms contribute to civil rights harms, when their algorithms promote violence, when their algorithms facilitate how if you like a white supremacist group or racist content, you'll be recommended to Facebook groups where, to your point, these individuals, these organizations are doing the kind of planning today they never could have done before. And I'll say one other thing, and Mr. Congressman, I direct this to you, but particularly to the other members on both sides. ADL has done the surveying and the data. Nearly 80% of Americans think the laws need to be changed to hold these companies responsible. That's not 80% of Democrats. That's not 80% of Republicans, 80% of Americans. So there was never a better way that you could get something that all Americans would agree to. And I dare say, Mr. Congressman, nothing you could do that would better secure our society than making these companies accountable once and for all.
Well, thank you. And of course, we've got a bill that just does that, which we hope will move this year, Protecting Americans from Dangerous Algorithms Act, which would begin to hold them accountable, not for the fact that there is bad content on their websites, which is probably an insoluble problem, but for the fact that their recommendation algorithms are designed to introduce that content to the very people in our society who are most susceptible to it. So thank you so much for highlighting that.
Mr. Congressman, I just want to build your bill, and that with Congressman Eshoo is so important. Imagine if NBC News was programming content promoting suicide to depressed teenagers. Imagine if a newspaper was delivering content on how to traffic human children to pedophiles. Like, you wouldn't allow it if it happened in those places. There is no excuse. There is no world in which it is reasonable for companies like Facebook to promote violent Islamism or white supremacy to people who are prone to violence, and they should be responsible for that. Thank you for your legislation, and hopefully we'll make them responsible for that.
Thank you, sir. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes another gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Gottheimer.
Thank you. It's good to have a Jersey day here, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much for this important hearing to discuss terrorist threats to our national security, whether it's from terrorist groups abroad or lone wolf terrorist attacks or domestic extremists. The threats to the homeland are more pressing than ever. I was very proud to lead a bipartisan effort in this committee to address lone wolf terrorists using trucks and other vehicles as weapons. This legislation, which has passed the House and is now in the Senate, is named in memory of New Milford resident Darren Drake, a victim of the 2017 New York terror attack. Mr. Reggio, if I can start with you, many of the threats we're seeing today in the homeland look like the ones I described with Darren Drake, lone wolf terrorist actors and senseless acts of violence. What recommendations do you have for this committee to best address the many Americans who are being inspired by ISIS and other extreme terrorist groups abroad? What more could be done to prevent this type of radicalization?
Oh, thank you, sir. And as a fellow New Jerseyan, it's good to be bookended by a New Jersey congressman. Thank you. Yes, to me, the biggest component of this radicalization, particularly of individuals in the West, is on social media. It's on Twitter. It's on Facebook. It's on all of the social media platforms. This is a very YouTube particularly. For instance, an American cleric, Anwar al-Awlaki, his teachings are still available. He was a very influential cleric, well-spoken. His family from Yemen. His teachings, he inspired the attack at Fort Hood and others as well. His teachings are still online. I can follow the Taliban spokesman for years and years at a time. They're not taken offline. It's obvious to everyone. And we're not talking about these are individuals that are just putting out innocuous news. Like the Taliban spokesmen are promoting violence, promoting violent videos and things. And there's a host of jihadists in a range of groups that have information that is readily available to all, and everyone knows who they are and nothing is done about it. I will say it makes my research a lot easier, but I'd much rather not see this information online and these individuals out there who are able to reach people in the United States or Europe or any country and inspire them to join these terrorist groups. This is why a lot of Westerners traveled to Iraq and to Syria when that was under Islamic State control. They were seeing what was happening there via recruitment videos or just information. They were told the caliphate has been restored. As long as these individuals are able to post this information on social media, you will have individuals who are prone to being susceptible to this type of information being recruited by jihadist organizations.
Thank you, and I support Mr. Malinowski's legislation and other legislation that I've been behind to help stop that and to take on, frankly, a lot of our social media companies that continue to allow handles from terrorist organizations to be online. They take them down, they come back up. They're not policed properly or monitored. They're actually foreign terrorist organizations. They're violating State Department law and rules, and I think we need to be very aggressive against them. If I'm going to turn down to Mr. Greenblatt, it's a great honor to have you here today as a witness. Thank you for your leadership and your thoughtfulness, especially in light of the horrible threats and attacks against the Jewish community this month. It's more important than ever to address anti-Semitism head on. So thank you for your work. As you mentioned in your opening remarks, Amnesty International released a completely biased and wrong report calling Israel an apartheid state. We know that Amnesty International fails to recognize the Arab Party and the governing coalition, or Arab Israelis serving in the military, amongst many other realities of civil society in Israel and of the impact of the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. In fact, this is the 208th report the group has issued about Israel since the 1970s. They had only 40 reports on North Korea and 61 on Venezuela. Can you please talk about how this report may lead to a rise in anti-Semitism and an increase in terror attacks against the Jewish people, and what you think is driving Amnesty International to take such an aggressive stance?
Well, first of all, let me just say, Mr. Congressman, I realize following Mr. Malinowski and my fellow panelists and you, like I'm racing in the street in the Badlands of this New Jersey moment. And so I'm going to try, I think I'm on fire here, but I'm going to try to specifically keep my remarks focused on this Amnesty report. Look, I mean, I almost don't want to dignify it with time today. The problem is that when you make wild aspersions and groundless accusations against the Jewish state, it has an immediate knock-on effect against the Jewish people. To release this report 6 months, again, after Jews are being beaten and brutalized in broad daylight, not by people wearing MAGA hats and not by people espousing white supremacy, but by people coming from anti-Israel rallies, is shocking. A report which doesn't call into question other countries around the world which have Christian principles or Muslim principles. It is only the Jewish state that they seem to call out. And it would be interesting. I didn't know it was the 280th report, but what I do know is I will be dealing with the cyberbullying targeting Jewish activists online. I will be dealing with the Jewish kids on college campuses who are afraid to identify as being Israeli or having any role, even showing up at Hillels because of fear of being bullying and intimidation by anti-Israel types. And I think it's frightening, you know, so I think it's a terrible report. It's going to cause, I promise you, I predict it. I'll be back on this committee talking about threats against Jews spawned by this kind of accusation. And lastly, let me just say, I say this as someone, Representative Gottheimer, who believes in a two-state solution, who believes we need dignity and equality for Palestinians. But if you think demonizing and delegitimizing the only Jewish state in the world is the way you're going to achieve it, like the folks from Amnesty are as far from reality as you could imagine. It may be Amnesty International, but it's like reality somewhere else, because I don't understand how that makes sense of it. And look, there will be no surrender to these people. They may be in their glory days with all this hateful rhetoric, but I think the brilliant disguise of them showing up as human rights advocates will not work for the majority of good thinking of Americans who realize what they're doing.
Thank you. Thank you, sir, and I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Let me thank our witnesses for today. We don't have any other person scheduled, but clearly the length and involvement of members shows the importance of this topic. So I want to thank you for your testimony, as well as the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. The chair reminds members that the committee's record will remain open for 10 business days. Without objection, committee stands adjourned. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you,
Great
Mr.
hearing.
Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Good seeing everybody.
Too, sir.